The story begins with an introduction to the main character. She, as the only witch on the continent, lived for 300 years, but at the same time, she possessed incredible power. She had the power to destroy one country, but her hatred for humans was so great that it gave her goosebumps, so she decided to lock herself away and live in the mountains. However, some unknown guy was sitting in front of her on his knees, with tears in his eyes, and asking for help. Our heroine was of her mind until she met him. She still saved him and followed him all the way to the kingdom. Something in her heart sank at that moment. But did she really leave? The question was rhetorical because she stood next to him and supported him in everything. Moreover, her feelings were so great that she offered the throne into his arms, but what awaited her in the end she could not expect. An unexpected swing of the sword, lowering her head, Irina saw a bloody blade sticking out of her chest. Her legs immediately weakened. The guy at that moment looked at her with an empty gaze and quoted her words. She once told him to kill everything that irritates him. So being a witch, she died at the hands of the only person she trusted. Fortunately, her life essence was not destroyed, so her spirit escaped before her death. She could regain her strength and be reborn in the spirit world for about 10 years. That's what she thought, until her eyes began to see everything around her, and her ears began to hear unknown girls stood in the room and did not understand why the child did not cry. Yes, that's right, Irina just entered the body of this newborn. She certainly couldn't have foreseen that. She didn't understand how a formless speck of dust floating in the spirit world could have so much power to enter this body. The maids were also perplexed at this time, but for a different reason. At that moment, the girl decided to slap the child on the bottom. To hear at least some emotions, Irina was perplexed. It would have been possible to preserve the dignity of a witch. Our heroine could only accept this shame, and the maids realized that the child did not react to them in any way. One of them suggested calling a doctor. Her assistant suddenly realized that she should not do this under any circumstances, because then His Majesty might call her useless. They did not want to think about what he might do to the child. The girl sighed heavily and decided that she needed to be sure, which meant she decided to spank him again. Irina was shocked. To relive this shame again? She still decided that she had to at least pretend that she was crying. Otherwise, she would not be able to avoid double shame in a minute. The maids were immediately incredibly happy because this child was finally able to cry. It was a real relief for them. They joyfully began to stroke the girl, while our heroine was perplexed by how pathetic little people could touch her body. The girls with smiles on their faces told the child, their beautiful princess, that she must survive, and under no circumstances could she die. Our heroine now didn't really understand their words. Why would a witch have to leave this world anyway? At that moment, Irina knew nothing of the crazy future that lay before her, but she still couldn't do anything even if she had known. The action moves forward some time. The girl was lying in the cradle and looking at the toys, wondered, why did she become like this? Although, why is she asking herself this if something else is much more interesting? Why did this freak whom she helped decide to betray her? It's time to meet him. This innocent at first glance traitor turned out to be the youngest prince of the kingdom of Carell. His name is Lacuz. Hated by his brother, the crown prince, he was ambushed while cutting through the southern desert. He barely survived the attack and then fled. He eventually crawled to her ridge and knelt before her. At that time, she felt like she was under a spell, like she fell in love at first sight. As people say, she thought that was exactly what she felt. It was because of all these thoughts in her head that she decided to give him power and the throne. But on the day he promised to propose to her, the ring was missing. Instead, he gave her a sword, which he pierced her body with. And yet, if you think about it, she was right, because as she had assumed, she shouldn't have trusted someone like a human. Irina was pouting at that moment, because she had never thought that she would end up in the body of such a child. Then, thinking about it, she decided that it might be for the best. 10 years was a long time for a person, and it would be a long time for this traitor Lacuz too. Our heroine's eyes lit up because she understood that thanks to this body, she would be able to take revenge on him much faster. The girl immediately began to support herself, repeating to herself the motto that she had been guided by all her life. Revenge must be quick and precise. At that moment, the child picked up the toy that was in her cradle and began shaking it with all her might. The girl thought that she would definitely get to Lacuzzi, Just then, a maid entered the room, smiling, because she saw the already awakened princess in front of her. It was through the maid's reminder that our heroine realized that she would not be able to carry out her revenge, so first she had to grow up a little. The maid came to the crib and offered to give her something to eat or change her diaper. Irina shook her head in bewilderment, not even wanting anyone to touch her body. At this moment, the maid was shocked because she realized that the princess recognized all the words that she had just said. Irina grimaced. Although she couldn't say it, she thought that she was definitely not some humble human child, but an incredible witch. The maid came closer and told the princess that she was an amazing person, but she would still prefer that the princess were normal. Moreover, she would like no one to know about her existence, because that is how she will live a long life. Our heroine was still surprised by the girl's words. It was very strange that a person spoke such profound words with such a calm expression on his face. If she says something like that, then she was scared to even imagine what country she was born in. At that moment, the maid, perplexed, freed herself from these thoughts, saying that it was not worth saying such things during a meal, so it was better to eat something tasty. Of course, our heroine didn't want anyone to touch her, so she didn't want to eat, but the maid left saying she'd be back soon. It seems no one understood the child. As Irina expected, people are too stupid. Although it is even better that way because she prefers silence. When she was a witch, only one person could challenge her. To think that she was currently in such a weak human body, Irina knew that it would be good if this body had 1-star mana. But now, all that was left was to hope that she would at least be able to feel the mana of this body. Our heroine crossed her arms, and sighing heavily, began to immerse herself in her thoughts. After just a few moments, her eyes opened in horror. Although perhaps it would be more correct to say in shock. Irina was perplexed, because in this body slept mana close to 5 stars. When she was at this age, she only had 2 stars. The girl was incredibly happy because she realized that this body was simply brilliant. Immediately, she began to think about her wet dreams and wonder if she should take over the entire continent. And yet she set herself a very ambitious goal, to conquer the world. But at that moment, the maid approached the princess, surprised to hear that she was not crying at all. This was exactly the problem. Her current reality is a world where she is a little child who can't even speak properly. The girl knew for sure that if she could die of shame, she would do it right now. Suddenly, the maid took the girl in her arms and said that today was a very sunny day, which meant it was worth going for a walk. Taking the princess in her arms, the maid assured her that she was safe here, so she needed to go outside more often. Our heroine looked at the maid who was speaking so calmly, and at the same time did not understand why she was so calm. Irina didn't know what empire she was a princess of, but she wasn't of royal blood either. So who could harm her, she said. At this point, the maid began to say that this place was called the Dandelion Palace. All the princes and princesses were born here, and the princess should be here too until she is 5 years old. Soon after reaching the age of 5, she will choose a sword and receive a separate palace. But in any case, this is only in the distant future. While the maid knew that she could also feel at ease, our heroine listened attentively to all her words. Soon, she began to twitch, thinking that this girl should not speak as if she did not understand anything. It was better to speak in detail. The maid laughed and did not understand why the princess was so angry. She knew that she would not do this without a reason, so she wondered why she was acting like this. The girl assumed that the princess was hungry, and she had recently changed her diaper, so the reason must be different. At that very moment, the girl who had only been speaking suddenly fell silent and shuddered in horror. The girl instantly bowed, indicating that she was greeting His Imperial Majesty. Our heroine turned her head in bewilderment and saw a guy in front of her. And this is the Emperor? He somehow reminded her of a magical swordsman. Moreover, he had a handsome appearance, and it even seemed to her that she had seen his face somewhere many times. Irina tried to remember, but she couldn't. Had she really gotten that old? She decided to leave that question for later. In any case, he was apparently human, and she had never felt such strong pressure except when meeting a dragon. At this point, the emperor finally spoke his words. He said that the girl had white hair and red eyes. The maid bowed down and said that the princess really did resemble her father, and she suspected that she had the purest blood. Moreover, she even assumed that she saw the form of Eskina in front of her. Our heroine immediately came to her senses. she realized that they were talking about the northern dragon, with whom she had not gotten along very well. The girl folded her hands in bewilderment, simply wondering how this weirdo's name had even come up. The emperor was no less interested, so he raised his hand and said that they should verify the maid's words. The man touched the girl and caused strange but painful sensations, causing the girl to exclaim in bewilderment. She didn't understand what this sick man was doing to the baby, but she knew he had to get what he deserved. Irina restrained herself with all her might, but in the end, she still decided that it was his own fault. The girl grabbed the emperor's hand and bit it sharply, causing the maid to almost faint. Our heroine felt that he himself was to blame. The emperor, perplexed, asked what had just happened, and the maid asked the girl to calm down. The girl turned her head and began to say that this was all a mistake that her highness had made because she was too small. The maid asked to be merciful to the girl and not to pay attention to it. The emperor, in turn, showed surprised interest. After all, a child who bites her opponent instead of crying is quite funny. The man decided that the girl had potential and a chance that she would choose the sword. The maid, horrified, began to dissuade His Majesty, saying that the princess was still young and had not even had her first birthday. In turn, the emperor said that she was a child who had survived the blow of his power. Irina, perplexed, began to curse in her thoughts, not understanding what this man was doing. The man turned his gaze to the girl and said that she even liked it, although it certainly didn't look like it. Suddenly, he said a name, Leona. It was this name that the emperor decided to settle on. Looking at the princess, he asked her to see whether her teeth would become the teeth of a lion, the king of beasts, or the teeth of a crude magical beast. Continuing to look at the puzzled girl, he said that he hoped that she would live up to his expectations. Our heroine sighed heavily. There must be things that the emperor can say to a child, and things that he cannot. He is a very strange guy. Suddenly, the girl began to examine the emperor's equipment and realized that these were the scabbards that she had seen so often. She began to go through all sorts of options from her memory, which did not return to her very well, when suddenly she was struck by lightning. This is a sheath that was made from the horns of a black dragon that was defeated and killed by humans. The handle of the sword is made from the wings of a fairy queen that was also killed by humans. At that moment, she fixed her gaze on his eyes and began to dissuade herself, saying that it was simply impossible. Her body was covered in goosebumps, and she in turn continued to talk herself out of it, realizing that she simply shouldn't think about it. The maid looked at the princess in surprise and assumed that she was in a lot of pain, so she decided to call a doctor. If she hadn't decided to go outside, this could have been avoided. The maid said in a trembling voice that tomorrow the girl would be choosing a sword, and unfortunately, according to the laws of the empire, nothing could be done about it. In conclusion, she said that from now on, the princess would be drawn into a battle for succession to the throne. Our heroine was shocked with every minute she spent here. What was going on and where did she end up? Of all the empires in the world, there is only one where men must choose the sword and plunge into the succession. And if this is truly the place, then the emperor she just met must be that guy. The power that smells like a dragon, white hair and blue eyes. There's only one person who fits the criteria. Our heroine realized that she had screwed up big time, and at that moment, the maid announced that the princess's name was Leona von Hasis. The girl told the princess that she should remember this, because it was important. But our heroine was busy with something else. She didn't understand what the probability was that she was born the daughter of a man who was trying to get rid of her. Still, she decided that she had hit the nail on the head, and not exactly a good one. Probably everyone is interested in who this emperor of the Hasis Empire is, and the answer was simple. This is a great being of this world who inherited the blood of the dragon. And also, this is the same guy who fought with her like she was some kind of mongrel. More than 20 years ago, there was a group of traders who tried to cross the mountain range without her permission. It was obvious that in defending her territory, our heroine had defeated this trading group. However, this trading group was not only in the possession of the Hasis Empire, the most powerful empire, but also belonged to the Imperial family. It would have been a relief if that had been the end of it for our heroine. But these traders were also transporting national treasure. So what happened? This mad emperor decided to destroy Irina. If she hadn't cast aside her pride as a witch and escaped by turning into a rat, even her spirit would have been destroyed. After that, even when she slept, her head was facing away from the Hasis Empire. Just think she was born the daughter of this freak. And yet, even if she was unlucky once, how can she be so unlucky? After the girl realized everything, she seriously considered giving up her body. The reason for this was that if the Emperor discovered that she had entered this body, then she would truly just disappear. But still, she was stopped by one fact that she had also learned not long ago. 5-star mana, like the blood of this body, was too precious. Only the strong will survive. This is the phrase that permeates the entire Hassis imperial family. It is even said that the previous emperor had as many as 38 children, which begs the question, why were there so many? And it was all simple because the emperor forced them all to fight each other until only one remained. The last surviving child would become the emperor ruling the continent. Apparently, this madman killed his 37 brothers and sisters to become emperor. Our heroine knew for sure that she couldn't give up because this was a place for the survival of the fittest. Just think of it, a world driven only by murder. Irina squealed happily, thinking that for a powerful witch, there simply couldn't be a better scene. In any case, she, born the 12th Imperial Princess, found herself caught up in the struggle for the throne. If this was the standard procedure, she could have been protected in the Dandelion Palace until she was 5 years old, but this stupid goat emperor will most likely put her before the sword. And that means only one thing. Still, Irina wondered what he wanted from a child who couldn't even use her limbs properly. But she had a feeling that she had been recognized by the one who tried to kill her. That is why the girl decided that she would definitely become an empress. Our heroine looked around the hall, which was filled with hundreds of people looking at her. She decided that she had to become empress and destroy the kingdom of Carell, which was ruled by a freak named Lacuse. Only in this case could our heroine rule the entire continent using this powerful body. The maid bowed and addressed the princess. She asked her to choose one of the boys who would become her sword. It was at this moment that the princess realized that choosing a sword did not mean the direct meaning of this expression. As a member of the royal family, she will need to choose someone to be her right hand. The girl knew that this was a very responsible act, so she had to choose wisely. And in any case, even if there are many people standing here, she can only choose one. Our heroine pointed to the nameless girl. Meanwhile, the guy with green hair was surprised that the princess had just chosen this girl. The boy smiled and decided that the emperor's words were indeed true. The action moves to the previous night. The same guy asked in surprise if the emperor had really met the 12th princess. He asked in surprise how this had happened. Had he really run into the princess when he was checking what was buried in the Dandelion Palace? In any case, he was curious. What kind of person was she, and whether he could place hopes on her? The emperor gave an answer that the boy certainly did not expect to hear. The man asked him to keep an eye on the girl. The guy was certainly surprised, because he had dedicated himself to the first imperial prince who was known as a true genius, at the same time ignoring the second unremarkable prince, although he possessed rather rare magic. The boy thought about it because the emperor said that the 4th prince, who was blessed by the sun god, and the 6th princess, who was a black magician, were simply useless. He then asked if the 1-year-old princess was really so good that he was even ordered to look after her. He really thought so, but he decided that he was glad that he had canceled his meeting with the 2nd prince and come here. He was able to see how that very woman was chosen, as well as the beautiful and sweet face of the princess. At that very moment, the guy stopped himself from such strange thoughts and asked himself what he was even thinking about. The boy looked at the girl and did not understand why she was so cute that she made him think about such things. Our heroine turned her head in surprise and began to make baby sounds. It was so sweet that it even touched his heart, which is why the guy began to feel strange sensations. Looking at the princess, he increasingly realized that he wanted to squeeze her cheeks, and these thoughts devoured him. At this moment, the knights approached the advisor and asked if he was okay. The guy tried to get up, but as soon as he saw the princess's sweet smile, he fell to the ground again. However, in turn, our heroine was less happy to see this guy because she knew who it was. He is the emperor's assistant and a first-class knight, and his name is Harriet Ulizer. It was he who destroyed 5 ogre colonies in one day, and that is why he was nicknamed the Knight of Destruction. Moreover, even our heroine fought with him before. But this fight was strange. One time, Harriet tried to cross his mountain without permission, so she just beat him up. Our heroine knew in any case that the guy was much stronger now than he was then. As expected, people here grew up much faster. And still, she didn't understand why this guy lost consciousness, because he always smiled when he saw her. Well, in any case, no matter how sorry she was, she didn't care because she had other more important things to do. Our heroine chose Cage Atperth for herself, and she was the most powerful necromancer on the continent. Cage Atperth, an amazing necromancer who can resurrect the dead and use their power. She could endlessly summon an army as long as there were corpses nearby, and it was very difficult to fight against them, so she was suitable for the princess as a guard. Her story even reached Irina when she was stuck on a mountain range. This girl killed 20 wyverns, which are rumored to be difficult for even 5 middle-class knights to kill. The monsters were easily destroyed by Cage and turned into undead, and the kingdom of Jacques, which tried to kill her, was destroyed in just one day. That's exactly what the rumors were about her, because Cage Atperth had caused such an incident. Our heroine even wanted to fight her herself, but unfortunately, this did not happen. And in any case, the girl never came to her mountain range again. And yet our heroine was very glad that they were able to meet, even if only now. Finally, Cage became the sword she chose, which means she must protect the princess. But still, our heroine didn't understand why they were forcing Cage to take care of a small child. Well, at least everything turned out well. Our heroine knew that if the girl was on her side, then the princess would be safe. Leona was actively trying to get to Cage Atperth at this time, which caused her to get a little scared and start walking back. Our heroine was in shock and did not understand why she was moving back, because she had not done anything. Leona continued to draw attention to herself, while Cage Atperth continued to fade away. At some point, she assumed that the princess had managed to get hurt somewhere, and our heroine was already losing her nerve. What difference does it make what she thinks if she has no right to ignore her request? Starting to rub her eyes, she thought that she was already sweating and was starting to feel sick in this hot room, and now Cage had decided to get on her nerves. However, something amazing happened, because Cage began to run forward, after which she approached the princess and took her hand. Our heroine could barely hold back her tears, but she is only a fragile 1-year-old child who cannot be grabbed like that. Irina was certainly not thrilled with this small body, but she had already promised that everyone should just wait, and then all of them. At that moment, as if by God's miracle, the maid who had been addressing Cage and asking what had happened ran in. Our heroine sighed heavily, thinking that only Rin understood her. Looking at the maid, our heroine decided to take back her words about the girl being useless. Rin at this point turned to Cage Atperth again and said that the princess was most likely in pain, so why not let her go? Suddenly, the girl noticed another guy behind the maid who embarrassed her. The girl instantly tugged him and pulled him towards her, causing the guy to even exclaim a little. Soon he started talking about the princess, saying that his name was Vel and that he was a therapist. Our heroine certainly didn't understand anything, so she even wondered why a therapist was suddenly needed. Scratching his head, the man said that this girl was quite quiet and shy, but the way she was pulling him towards her, it looked like she wanted him to examine the princess. The man smiled and asked Rin if he could afford to do it. Irina was outraged because she did not understand why no one asked her. What she thought Vel suddenly turned to the princess saying that he would need her hand for a moment. Our heroine was angry. She thought that this man was simply useless, and she would never take back her words. In any case, he began the examination. After just a few moments, the therapist came to his senses and started shouting, saying that they should call a priest. Rin was confused, which caused her to start screaming back, asking the therapist what he even meant. The man continued to try to make himself heard in a hurry, so he began to say that the girl was overflowing with mana. At first, our heroine didn't understand what was going on, because the problem was that she was completely fine. The girl began to bare her teeth, because she began to understand that most likely there was a charlatan standing in front of her. Unexpectedly, Vel said that 5-star mana was raging inside this small body. At that very moment, our heroine's face changed from frank discontent to surprise. Apparently, this was not a charlatan. Vel continued to say that someone had forcibly injected mana into the girl, and if it wasn't cured immediately, the princess's life would be in danger. Rin covered her mouth with her hand in confusion. She had been wondering all this time why the princess was sweating so much. Of course, no one thought that she was hot because she was a fire witch, and they also noticed that the princess's shoulders were shaking. Our heroine, in turn, realized that this was all because she was happy with the thought that she would soon become an empress. Rin, like everyone else in the room, assumed she was in a lot of pain. How could she endure it without crying? Rin said with tears in her eyes that the princess would just keep smiling. But she didn't understand how she could be so determined. Irina knew that she was the one who originally had 5-star mana. Then Vel assumed that she had received Eskina's blessing, which was even an insult, because she is strong without the power of this dragon. In any case, the man decided that he would call a doctor as soon as possible, and our heroine was perplexed that no one understood her. After a while, the girl said that she could still feel the mana, but fortunately, it didn't seem like there would be any big problems with it, because they responded quickly. The girl looked at Cage and said that first of all, they had to stay calm. In this case, the girl responded that she was already leaving, so she asked to call her at any time if any difficulties arose. Cage Atperth suddenly thought about it. She remembered how the Emperor had told her to swear an oath on the River of Death. The girl simply could not do anything but resign herself and swear, so she did what she had to do. Cage Atperth looked into the cradle at the sleepy Princess Leona and thought about how she was so small but already so strong. She was like a bunny, a little Imperial princess who wouldn't be scared or run away, and who could one day become a powerful predator. While the princess was trying to fall asleep, Cage stood over her crib and poked her cheek. The girl couldn't tear her gaze away, because at that moment, she knew one thing for herself. She would protect the princess. The action moves to the next day. The maids were running around the palace, actively discussing something. Someone asked for food. Someone was wondering where the bed linen was. Our heroine opened her eyes and immediately noticed how lively it was in the palace today. The reason for this was simple, because today she was moving into her own palace. In theory, she should live in the Dandelion Palace and receive protection for up to 5 years. But since she has become a participant in the battle for succession, she must move. Suddenly, our heroine noticed a suspicious look on her. Turning her head, she noticed Rin. After the fake incident with the overflowing magic, it seems that Rin, who lives with the princess, is worried about her leaving the safe zone. Irina thought for a moment, and then threw these thoughts away, because there was no need to think about it. Our heroine was so determined only because her guard was Cage Atperth. And yet at that moment, the girl began to retreat, which left our heroine still perplexed. The girl was still strange. In turn, she thought about what a bunny princess is. Our heroine, in turn, noticed that, since the last time when their eyes meet, Cage just starts blushing and moving away. Our heroine sighed heavily and wondered, was her smiling face really that scary? At this point, the maid noticed that the princess was a little sad, which is why she decided to approach her and ask what had happened. Our heroine certainly wasn't bored. The problem was that Cage Atperth was keeping his distance from her. She pointed at her with her hand, but Rin, of course, didn't understand the gesture. The maid didn't understand, but she said that they would need a little more time to sort everything out. Then she took out an interesting toy and asked if she should give it to Leona to play with, or maybe she wanted a pacifier. Our heroine was perplexed, because the Great Witch certainly didn't need anything like that. Rin began to apologize to the princess and say that she would not be so harsh with her anymore. But she wasn't going to give up. The girl looked into the toy box and started looking for one of the options. Soon she seemed to see the right option. She took out a plush bunny and held it out to the princess. Our heroine was undoubtedly surprised, because she did not expect to see this bunny. Moreover, it is blackened with dust, and its condition is terrible. It looks as if it should be thrown out already, and yet, after taking a closer look, our heroine decided that this was a very unusual bunny. Rin, at this time, who was trying to please the princess, somehow assumed that the bunny was old, so she began to take it away. Our heroine, perplexed, snatched the bunny, making it clear that it was now hers. The maid was very surprised by the princess's behavior, so she asked what had happened. Our heroine certainly didn't know why, but she felt the dark magic inside this bunny. If she always carried it with her, this mana would feed her body. The princess's mana was already at level 5, and if it became even more, it would be simply wonderful. Rin was incredibly happy that she was finally able to find something that the princess liked. After some time, our heroine managed to fall into a sweet sleep hugging this doll. Cage Atperth looked at the child in surprise and asked the maid what kind of doll it was. Rin replied that it was brought here by the princess's mother from the Principality of Aslan. While she was handing over this toy, she clarified that she had played with this doll all her childhood. And she brought it when she joined the Imperial family. And why does no one know? Rin wiped away her tears, saying that no one could have imagined that the princess would like this bunny. It would have been even better if the Empress saw her daughter like this. After putting together everything the maid had said, Cage Atperth immediately realized that the princess's mother was dead. The maid suddenly sighed and said that most likely their princess was lonely, because she was now at the age when she should feel parental warmth, but she cannot. She was only 1 year old and already caught up in a battle for the throne. Cage Atperth suddenly said that she was not such a strong person. Rin started saying that even if Leona becomes stronger in the future, she is weak now. That's why Cage Atperth assured the maid that she would protect the princess. The two of them looked at the princess and smiled, thinking that this was simply a miracle. The action moves forward some time. The two of them were walking under cover of night. Cage Atperth was shouting in bewilderment that they should not go to the palace of the Black Rose under any circumstances. Rin ran in a hurry and held the princess in her arms. She remembered asking if this was the palace where the ghosts of the dead royals lived. Cage Atperth was incredibly outraged, saying that she didn't know how anyone could fit a child into that place. At this time, our heroine did not understand why it was so loud here, and why Cage was afraid of someone who said something like that. The girl started screaming and saying that she would report everything to the Emperor right now, because it was wrong. Rin, at this point, screamed and asked her to stop, also saying that she would tell everything. The girl admitted that in truth, she was asked to bring the princess to the Black Rose Palace. Cage Atperth seemed speechless at this point. She immediately screamed and said that Rin had gone crazy. The girl turned her head and pointed the lantern at the palace, continuing to say that this place was literally worse than garbage. Rin herself was not delighted, because she screamed, saying that this was the Empress's dying wish. She explained that the Empress had said that the princess must be brought to this place, so she really had no choice. The maid explained that she herself did not like it, but she had to fulfill the will of the Empress. At that very moment, Cage Atperth changed his anger to kindness and his puzzled words to words of support. The girl said that she really liked this palace, and it was very cool. Our heroine, of course, was glad that Rin and Cage Atperth found a common language. But now our heroine was also interested in what kind of palace this was about, which there were amazing rumors. Rin, at this point, apologized to the princess, saying that she had thought about it for a long time, but she would still try to fulfill the Empress's will. If she doesn't quite like it, she will ask His Majesty again, but she needs to be patient a little longer. Irina, with every word Rin said, became more and more interested in this palace, about which everyone was saying something terrible. At that moment, she decided to turn her head and look at him. It seemed that there was nothing scary about him, but it did look a bit like there were ghosts there, although it would be even stranger if they actually lived there. Our heroine assumed that the mother of this body was a strange person, and if not, then she was interested in why the last wish was to send her to this palace. Suddenly, the girl turned around sharply, because she felt a strange smell in the sky. In the end, she realized that she was not mistaken, because the palace was emanating dark mana, the same as in her bunny toy. Leona started waving her hands happily. She wanted to get there as quickly as possible, but the maid was very surprised by the princess's behavior. As they approached the palace, the mana became denser. But what was it? Perhaps there was something hidden in the palace. By the way, our heroine understood that if she felt it, then Cage Atperth should have too. However, looking at her, it seemed as if she didn't feel anything, which was strange. Our heroine realized that this girl was now stronger than her, which meant she had to feel this mana. At that very moment, an incomprehensible but strong gust of wind began, which made our heroine feel that even the wind contained magical power. Suddenly, a surprised voice was heard, asking what this was all about. The guy was perplexed and said that the child looked like he was about to pass away, so he wouldn't even touch him. Was he really going to have to fight for the throne with this? Irina didn't understand who this cheeky little emperor was, although it didn't matter how small she was. What mattered was why this little freak was bullying her. Our heroine began to hiss aggressively, making it clear that she was not particularly pleased with his company nearby. The boy asked again in confusion. He was interested in what the princess had just said. Our heroine started hissing at him again, in exactly the same way she wanted to convey that she wanted him to get out of here. In any case, Irina knew that if she were a little bigger, she would immediately crush this boy. At that moment, the guy raised his head and asked in surprise what it was. His gaze was directed at our heroine, or to be more precise, at her toy the bunny. The action is transferred to a few days ago. The advisor asked if His Majesty was really doing this. The Emperor was writing something at the time and was not particularly happy about being distracted. The man took off his glasses and asked what had happened this time. The advisor breathed in and out heavily, thinking that he was not afraid of anything. At this point, the guy finally decided to ask what it was and what the Emperor meant. Hadn't he heard what the servants were talking about? He explained that Princess Leona had a mana surge, and it was said that she had no less than a 5th-star level mana running uncontrollably through her body. The guy was perplexed and said that although they say it was not a big problem, because Cage Atperth took action quickly, at that moment the girl's life was in danger. The Emperor sighed and smiled. He understood that Cage was the one who was a necromancer, and therefore she would not be disappointed. The advisor asked the Emperor in bewilderment how he could smile when the princess almost died. At that moment, the man sighed in bewilderment and opened his eyes and asked what he wanted to tell him. The guy began to say in a trembling voice that he was asking if it was his doing. The Emperor folded his arms and in bewilderment told Harriet that he had no need for this, much less to kill his children. The man explained that since the sword selection was complete, the life of the Imperial princess was not in his hands, but in the hands of the other Imperial princes and princesses. Harriet Ulazar, even more perplexed, screamed and said that this was the whole problem. He did not understand how it was possible not to protect such a sweet and charming princess, and on the contrary, to leave her to die. He went on to say that in the Imperial palace full of horrible and unpleasant people, only Leona was sweet and beautiful. The boy asked His Majesty in bewilderment, hadn't he seen this beauty of the princess? After all this, how could Leona be sent to a deadly war? The Emperor thought for a moment, and soon replied that he had given the Imperial princess the Black Rose Palace. Harriet Ulazar almost fainted. He immediately began to say that His Highness already knew what kind of place this palace was. In any case, this is the palace where the previous first prince gathered all the members of the Imperial family who had renounced the throne and simply destroyed them. There are still things like bloodstains left in this palace, and it is also a place far from the central palace, so the possibility of murder is very high. Harriet slammed the table and told the Emperor that he was just awful. The guy asked what he would do if the Imperial princess died. The Emperor was surprised by such claims, so he said that in that case, it would not be fate. The advisor exclaimed in horror, telling the Emperor that he was simply a cruel man. The man suddenly said that for the first time, he doubted his penetrating gaze, since he continued to keep someone like Harriet Ulazar on his side. The guy meanwhile wiped away his tears and said that there was no better advisor than him. Suddenly, he said that he had definitely decided everything. He would protect this place and the Imperial princess. Dissatisfied, Harriet Ulazar still ran out of the Imperial office. By the way, their entire conversation was overheard by a little boy. At this time, the Emperor was delighted. Cage Atperth and even Harriet Ulazar, they are generous to the 12th princess, who is not even a year old yet. And this is very interesting. These were the words that the little boy did not understand. He did not understand who this 12th was, that they were showing such interest in her. He soon decided that he definitely wanted to see her in person, and if she was not worthy, he would get rid of her immediately. That's exactly what the guy thought, until he noticed such a small and cute living creature in front of him. The prince's heart seemed to be broken. He thought in bewilderment that Harriet Ulazar was a fool, since he could not describe even a quarter of the cuteness of this girl with his words. However, at that moment, Cage Atperth approached His Highness, wanting to know something. The guy raised his head, and at that moment, the girl asked if he had come on some business. The prince immediately folded his arms and asked if there was any purpose for this, and what if he came here just like that? Cage looked at him in bewilderment and asked him to admit that he was lying. The guy, even more perplexed, screamed and asked if she had really called him a liar. Cage Atperth nervously approached the prince, trying to say something, to which the prince, even more perplexed, asked when such a thing had ever happened. The girl was not particularly pleased with the prince's behavior, because it was too impudent. At that moment, the guy turned his attention to the strange toy. He began to say that although the princess was too young, he did not understand how they dared to give her such old junk. He asked to throw this trash away immediately. The prince immediately decided that if he bought her a new toy, made from the best materials, then she would definitely be happy. The guy smiled as he imagined everything he had imagined, and was truly proud of himself. Rin, at this point, turned to the prince and said that the doll was a gift from the late Empress, and the princess treasured it very much. And again, the guy, perplexed, began to try to say something, but could not coherently say anything. The maid smiled and said that it was true she was not even a year old yet. The prince asked in surprise if she knew that it was a gift from her mother. Our heroine looked at the guy with a puzzled look, and Rin only nodded to the prince. The guy screamed in confusion, saying that they were too amazing, which is why he needed time to hold her. Cage Atperth became very tense and immediately started talking about how she would not take part. At this point, the prince began to talk about how he would instead give her another gift. He raised his hand and began to cast a spell. His hand began to glow, and soon the princess began to glow. The guy smiled and said that it was a blessing from the sun god, which meant that she should take care of it. Our heroine was very surprised at this moment. What was that anyway? At this moment, the maid decided to clarify. This person is Prince Nikhil, the elder brother of the princess. Right now, he blessed them with the power of the sun, god that was given to him. Our heroine was even glad that she was able to meet her new brother. She started to approach him, but Nikhil didn't understand why all children were so cute. At that moment, he decided that he wasn't cute when he was a child. At that moment, the guy turned his head and said in parting that he would come again. After that, he headed where his eyes followed, and yet he still asked not to forget to close the gate. At that moment, the maid exhaled heavily, because fortunately for her, everything turned out well. Cage Atperth suddenly decided to break the silence and say that they should close the gate after all. Rin, of course, didn't have much else to do, so she nodded her head, indicating that everything was fine. At this time, our heroine was surprised to think that this prince had blessed her with rapid growth. All this was fine, of course, but the prince's behavior left much to be desired. Because of this, Irina was convinced that she did not like people, and especially not people like Prince Nikhil. Moreover, looking at the palace, she even felt sorry that such strange children existed at all. But fortunately, time flew by, and all her suffering ended. The action takes us 3 years forward. Our heroine has grown up a bit and become even cuter. 3 years have already passed since she found herself in this body. This meant that now she could move herself. Now she could walk, and not lie helplessly in a crib. And what's more, she could already talk. However, just at that moment, our heroine began to sigh heavily, saying that she wanted to cry from such happiness. And yet, how did her life as a witch become so calm? Our heroine could not believe it. Leona always remembered that she was only 3 years old, which meant that everything was still ahead. Just at that moment, a joyful maid entered the princess's room and asked the princess if she had done everything. Our heroine was somewhat collected. In any case, she said that she was already collected and awake. The maid first asked the princess if she was hungry. In any case, it was better to go wash up, and she would bring something to eat right now. Suddenly, Leona did say that she was hungry, but she also said that she could wait a little. What was surprising at that moment was the look of the maid who for some reason had passed away. Our heroine also didn't understand what this look was about, so she decided to ask Rin what happened. The girl smiled and began to say that everything was fine. She was just staring at such a beautiful princess. Leona smiled and said that she knows and has heard all this because they tell her this. Everyone wonders where all the emperor's attractiveness went, and the answer is simple. It was passed on to her. Of course, if you compare it to the white times when our heroine was a witch, then it's nothing. At this point, the maid said that it was not for nothing, that she always said that the princess was the sweetest. After these words, she decided to move on to water procedures. The girl began to bathe the princess, and our heroine laughed and asked to be more gentle. Leona noticed that Rin had always been kind to her, but the question was, can she be trusted? Of course, Irina thought that it was simply impossible to do so. Based on past experience, our heroine was convinced that people can betray at any moment. Now, Leona is only kind to the maid because she is still a fragile 3-year-old child, not because of her sympathy for Rin. One way or another, Rin decided to ask the princess how she slept and whether she had any nightmares. The girl smiled and said that everything was wonderful, and she had a pleasant dream. The maid was, of course, surprised, so she decided to ask what kind of interesting dream she had. She smiled proudly and said that in her dream, her dad was killed many, many times. At that moment, Rin stopped and put away the towels. Our heroine was surprised by this, so she raised her head. She saw the bewildered maid in front of her, so she wondered, did she say something wrong? The girl immediately came to her senses and asked the maid not to worry, because she already knew that her dad would not die so easily. She finally exhaled with relief, deciding that the burden had been lifted from her shoulders, and now she could continue to have a nice conversation, but looking at Rin, she saw the same puzzled expression. Did she really say something wrong again? A moment later, the maid turned and ran to the door, calling Cage as she did so. The girl rushed out of the room and turned to Cage, saying that she needed to discuss something, so she invited her inside. Of course, the security guard didn't understand what all these actions were for, so she asked why they were doing this. Rin didn't believe that she couldn't come in, so she assured her that it wouldn't be for long, so she asked her to come in. A moment later, a confused Cage stood in the room, and Rin looked angry. Our heroine looked up and noticed that her guard was crying for some unknown reason. Irina was even more stunned by this, because she didn't understand why the girl was looking at her like that. The girl assumed that they definitely thought that by going outside, the little princess would not be able to overhear them. But Leona was already 3 years old and had full control over her mana, which meant that eavesdropping on people would be too easy. Soon she began to hear voices. The girl addressed Cage and repeated once again that when the princess was near her, she had to watch what she said. Rin didn't care about the circumstances because she simply didn't understand why she summoned the undead in the presence of the princess. The maid explained that the princess was now at the age when she needed to be surrounded by harmless things, joyful laughter. So why was Cage showing her all the horror? The girl stood and silently listened to the lectures from the maid, who summed up that the princess was having terrible dreams because of this, and she spoke about them too calmly. Irina was very surprised at the maid's words at that moment. She didn't understand what it meant that the undead were scary. Thinking about it, she decided that there were things that were even scarier, like the Emperor. By the way, she hadn't seen him since he was born. Even Rin hadn't asked him to come here. And if you think about it, 3 years ago, the Emperor was incredibly strong, but now he's probably a monster. Our heroine's dream was to become the Empress of this state, and to do this, she had to get rid of all her brothers and sisters. The girl thought that according to local laws, she had the right to kill the Emperor at the same time. Then, thinking, she asked herself, will she be able to defeat him? All this time, the maid scolded Cage, and finally said that if this happened even once more, she would experience the full brunt of her wrath. Looking at Cage, the girl asked if she understood everything. Leona's guard was very upset by this conversation, so she told the maid that she was very angry. The girl started saying that she wasn't angry yet, but then she decided that she should calm down, because now was not the time to quarrel. The maid said that the princess was probably hungry, so she needed to get some food. Cage sighed heavily and said that she was hungry too. Rin had already turned the corner at this time and was saying that in that case, she should go with them. She would prepare 2 portions. Irina, in turn, was still pondering her thoughts. After all, murders were commonplace in the Imperial family. It was dangerous to remain unarmed, but, on the other hand, Cage is a very powerful dark mage, and thanks to the barrier that Cage created, the assassins will not be able to get inside. Like right now, there was a hitman outside the window, and he couldn't seem to get in, so he just had to hang around. Our heroine looked at him openly and wondered, what is he trying to achieve? At this time, the guy looked into the princess's room and realized that her guard was not nearby. But another interesting question was how to get inside. Suddenly, the guy noticed how the princess walked out onto the balcony on her own, which meant that she had fallen right into his hands. But all you had to do was not leave your room. Looking at her, the hired killer wondered, what will she do now? In any case, he caught himself thinking that all the rumors were true, because the princess was very sweet. At that moment, our heroine leaned on the railing and turned to the guy. The girl asked him if he was strong. The guy sharply answered her that he was strong enough to kill her before she could blink. Leona smiled and said that this was very good, because then she wouldn't have any problems. The guy, of course, did not understand what she was talking about, but he did not have time to ask anything, because at that moment, the princess waved her hand and used magic. A huge ice ball flew rapidly towards the ill-wisher and touched him. A moment later, his feet began to freeze, He couldn't move anymore, so all he could do was ask what the hell that was. Our heroine looked at her hand in bewilderment, thinking that she was weak now, because her previous form would have killed this guy with this spell. In that case, the girl decided that it was worth just using another spell. Following the ice ball, the girl sent lightning. A huge charge hung over the guy, after which it pierced his entire body. He immediately began to scream in pain. Looking at this loser, our heroine thought that this was all just a waste of time, and using the magic of the third circle was a waste, although she could have fun. Unexpectedly, our heroine used healing magic, after which the guy felt relief. He looked at the princess and asked in surprise if she had really saved him. Irina noticed during her life that people are vile creatures. The strong mock the weak, but as soon as someone stronger than them appears, they submit to them. Our heroine smiled and told the guy that he almost guessed. She just didn't have time to have fun. The girl snapped her finger, and the lightning charge began to grow over the assassin's head again. The guy began to scream in bewilderment and ask him to stop. However, it was too late. The girl laughed, thinking that this was her much more like her real self. After some time, our heroine was lying on the bed, thinking that she was very sleepy. She soon wondered, could a sofa really be that soft? Rin had told her it was made of velvet, but that didn't exist in the kingdom, or even in the southern mountains. In general, although it was not time to relax, Cage would be with her all day, so something had to be done. Our heroine couldn't practice mana management in such an environment. Then, opening her eyes, the girl thought about another thought. What if she showed Cage that she was a mage? She soon decided to put those thoughts aside, thinking it was better not to reveal herself. It would be suspicious if a 3-year-old child used 3-star magic. Irina decided that this would attract even more prying eyes, and Lacuz would be able to find out about her. She didn't want to allow this to happen, because she understood that if this happened, this donkey would become even more dangerous. Irina must hide her power until she can wield it in complete peace, and if no one suspects anything, the entire Imperial family will obey her. Having pushed all these sweet thoughts away from herself, our heroine, nevertheless, decided that it would be better to take a nap now. The eyes closed, the body grew heavy, and the sofa became more and more comfortable. Sleep is truly wonderful! However, at that very moment, Nikhil burst into the room, addressing the rabbit. Our heroine stood up abruptly, hoping that this guy would leave her alone someday. The boy, perplexed, asked the princess if he should by any chance say hello to his older brother. Nikhil assumed that something was wrong, but our heroine still decided to say hello to him. By the way, Nikhil took it out every day for all 3 years, and he is already 10 years old at the moment. And in general, she could not understand the reason for his persistent appearances in front of her, because he was after all the crown prince. The girl sighed heavily and wondered, when would the boy fight her for the throne? In any case, Nikhil was wondering what happened to his sister, because she had a strange expression on her face. Suddenly, he began to stretch his hands. Our heroine at first did not understand what it was for, and after a couple of seconds, she began to pray to all the gods that it was not what she thought. Irina didn't even know how she, a 3-year-old child, could fight this guy. At this point, Cage intervened and warned the prince that he needed to wash his hands first. Nikhil objected in bewilderment, saying that they were already clean since he had washed them recently. And immediately, he began to do what he wanted to do. He began to squeeze the princess's cheeks, saying that she was very cute. Cage Atperth, perplexed, told him to be gentle because the princess was in pain. Nikhil in turn said that he knew better without her. He continued to squeeze the girl, saying that he was doing everything carefully, and if something happened, he would be able to cure her because she had the powers of the sun god himself. The guy smiled sweetly and turned his head to his sister, asking if she agreed with him. Leona was outraged. Her answer was a definite no. Did this guy really think she would believe the words of such a rude person? And again, Nikhil began to stretch his hand, only this time, our heroine slapped it away and asked the prince a question. Why does he keep doing this? The guy looked at the princess in surprise. Our heroine put her hands to the sides and asked if she hadn't expressed herself clearly. She repeated her question again. Every day he comes here uninvited and does whatever he wants. The guy was very surprised by what his sister was saying, so he decided to explain his actions by saying that he liked her. Our heroine certainly didn't expect to hear these words, so she asked again in surprise. However, Cage Atperth also joined the conversation and said that she also loved the princess. Nickel screamed in bewilderment and started talking about how he loved his sister more. Cage objected to him and said that it was impossible, and the guy was becoming more and more aggressive, so he told her to stop. While the guys were arguing among themselves, our heroine was overcome with bad memories, which is why she got upset. A long time ago, more than 300 years ago, when she was a completely ordinary person, Irina was found by a man. His name was Jin, and he was a good alchemist who knew his business. The man looked at the girl with a sad expression that day and asked where her parents had gone. Only our heroine was an orphan, one of many homeless children who die on the street. In any case, Jin noticed how exhausted the girl was, so he decided to ask when she had eaten last. He immediately handed her a sandwich. This man was the first to see her as a child, and not a beggar, and over time, she herself did not notice one fact. She became completely dependent on this man, and she was 5 years old at the time. The man watched the girl eat and decided to break the silence by asking her name, since he needed to address her somehow. He immediately became thoughtful and began to consider various name options that would suit the girl. Soon he looked at the girl and said that he thought the name Irina suited her. He smiled and said that it was definitely a great name, and its meaning was that no one could break such a young girl. Our heroine was embarrassed, lowered her eyes, and continued eating. She thought about her first name for a long time, and soon she realized that the emptiness in her heart began to gradually fill. There was a very warm and pleasant feeling inside, as if someone respected and appreciated her. When she told Jin about him, he simply smiled and patted her on the head. The man stroked her head and laughed, saying that it was love, and naturally, he also said that it was mutual. Our heroine still believed his words and considered them sincere. After that, they went to the tower, to the place where he lived, and she didn't even realize what was waiting for her ahead. At that time, something inexplicable happened in the tower. The child was sitting in a cage and screaming, begging to be saved. He called the doctor and begged him. The man snorted through his nose with absolute cold blood, saying that he was surprised that this child was still alive. At that moment, he turned to his assistants and said that it was worth getting rid of the trash because they were already useless anyway. The guys nodded their heads and went to carry out the order. Our heroine saw all these horrors, and unfortunately for her, began to realize what was happening here. Jin injected demonic powers into humans to create his own army. Even if countless children died, he was not prepared to stop. At that moment, the man turned to Irina. The guy said that he saw hidden potential in her. Those blood-red eyes, as well as blood-red hair, said it. The guy proudly declared that it only meant that she had an incredible amount of magical power. Doesn't she think that demons originally had a similar appearance? Our heroine was so scared that she couldn't even say a word. However, Jin knelt down and turned to the girl and offered to go with him. He was sure that she could handle it. Of course, Irina knew that she should give it up or run away, but she just couldn't do it. The reason was that it was even more terrible to be punished by this madman, who reminded her that she loved him, and therefore she could endure everything. As her flesh rotted from the demon's blood, as dark magic brought her to the brink of passing into another world, she was forced to wait and pray. One day Jin visited her, and with a sad look, he only said that she was useless. Leaving her alone, he left Irina alone with her thoughts. The girl did not understand why Jin said those words. Didn't he say that he loved her? While the girl was thinking about all this, Jin's displeasure could be heard, as he understood that he would have to look for children again, although it was not that easy to do. In the end, our heroine's hands dropped. The last thing she thought about was that it was all a lie. Jin turned to the dark figure and asked him to get rid of all the patients, because he no longer needed them. Our heroine felt something penetrate her mind. Her memories ended there. After she came to her senses, the tower was destroyed, and all the people inside were dead. Irina then realized that Jin's experiment had succeeded after all. The girl returned to this tower 3 years later, and she was sure that she was 8 years old. However, as her mind began to clear, she became an adult physically. She began to remember Jin's words. The guy said that once the experiment succeeded, he would call them all witches, and they would be the only witches in the world special. With tears in her eyes, the girl kept saying the word special. But what was the point? The man who said he loved her was just blatantly lying to her, and there is no one who could truly love her. That's why our heroine realized that she had escaped. The girl began to rise to her feet. Soon, she went to an unknown direction, thinking that people who say tender things always lie. So she continued to live alone for 300 years. Suddenly, the girl was brought back to consciousness by endless questions directed at her. It turned out that Nickel and Cage were standing over her in surprise, asking what happened. Leona scratched her head, thinking that she had been thinking too much about the past. Nickel was worried about his little sister, so he asked if everything was okay because she was sweating a lot. Cage also joined the conversation, suggesting that a doctor should be called. Nikhil asked her to move away, saying that the princess might be surprised because of her face. Cage said aggressively that the prince was surprised too. Nikhil started to bare his teeth, not understanding how Cage dared to say that. Our heroine wanted them to finally shut up, so the girl touched her brother's hand and said that she was okay. The girl tried to convey in an irritated voice that they shouldn't quarrel, so they should stop behaving like that. Nickel suddenly covered his mouth with his hand and, agreeing with the princess, began to laugh. Leona didn't understand what was wrong with this guy. She assumed she had insulted him, but either way, she really didn't understand him. Nevertheless, our heroine spoke to the guys, telling them not to say in her presence that they loved her because she did not want to hear it. The boys' faces were shocked. They didn't even know what to say, but the princess demanded that they say that they understood it. However, she also added the words that if they said something like that, they would die immediately. A few moments later, they were sitting behind the boxes and whispering. Nickel asked in bewilderment if the princess's mother was really dead. Then it turns out that she lives only with her maid. Our heroine exhaled heavily, as if with relief, because she did not understand what these two were talking about. Suddenly, someone put a hand on her hand. The guy started saying that there was something he could promise her. Nickel smiled at her and assured her that he would always be on her side. And then Cage came and said that her trusty sword would also be on her side. Nickel, perplexed, asked her to disappear. And again, the prince turned to the princess, beginning to talk about how he would be by her side and protect her. He assured her that even if he was part of the Imperial family, he would not let her die. Nickel would make sure that no one could harm her. He suggested that they promise each other this. And again, Cage joined the conversation, who said that she promised. In that case, Prince Nickel concluded that the princess now has two people who protect her. Cage Atperth went on to say that there will only be more people like this in the future. Nickel laughed and said that was true. There would be many more people who would love her. That's why he asked her not to make that face. Our heroine was glad to hear this, but she couldn't accept it, because she knew that he would eventually betray her, hurt her lie again. Nickel still assured his sister that he loved her just like Cage did. But Irina talked herself out of all these thoughts, telling herself that she would never believe them. And yet, after a couple of seconds, the boys were sitting and hugging the princess, telling her how cute she was. Our heroine was not happy with this, so she suddenly jumped up and told them to stop. She asked if she was a child. After all, she was a witch who had lived for 300 years, the Great Witch of the South. At that moment, Prince Nickel bent over and began to twitch silently. Our heroine did not understand what was happening. The way his shoulders are shaking indicates that he is truly scared. This is how a man should be in front of a powerful witch. However, as soon as our heroine sat down on the sofa, the guy opened his mouth and started laughing. Smiling, the guy asked if such a cute bunny was really offended by them. Irina was proud and did not want to talk. Our heroine shook her head, and Nikhil continued to tell her that she was very grown up and very strong. Cage Atperth interrupted their conversation again, starting to say that it sounded a bit off. Nikhil sighed heavily and told Cage that even if he tried to get along with her, he simply wouldn't be able to, because he really hated her. However, at that moment, something changed in the room. Our heroine felt that the airflow had changed. It was noticeable that dark magic was covering the entire room, and it was most likely coming from the window. Cage and Nickel suddenly jumped up from the couch, covering the princess with themselves, and asking who was there. A moment later, an unknown silhouette fell to the ground at the end of the room, meaning that the danger had passed. Nikhil immediately turned to his sister, saying that it was dangerous. He wondered if she was hurt. Cage was no less worried, so she turned around in surprise and asked if everything was okay. Looking at the sofa, Nikhil sighed with relief and said that the bunny was okay. Our heroine, in turn, sat with a very strange feeling because this was the first time someone had protected her. The girl went through all her thoughts, trying to understand what these feelings inside her meant. She was surprised, because earlier it seemed to her that it would not be so difficult for her to understand human emotions. She thought that it was quite natural, because hundreds of years had passed since meeting a person. In any case, she decided that it was a pleasant feeling, so everything was fine. The guys in turn just went to check on the unknown person. Nikhil kicked the man in confusion and asked if he had killed him. Cage sighed and suggested that it could have been her. However, at that moment, Harriet appeared behind our heroine like a ghost and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. Irina looked at this smiling guy in bewilderment and did not understand when he even ended up there. It wasn't that she was really scared, it was just that she was surprised because she didn't feel his mana. By the way, she had a feeling that this guy was crying because of her punch just yesterday. Just think how much he has grown. Still, it was really annoying because she had hoped that she would find a way to grow and become stronger than this guy. Anyway, Harriet laughed and asked the princess to calm her guards down because they were scaring the princess. The advisor smiled and told the princess that she could relax because he was there and could protect her. The boy turned to Nikhil and asked how he was going to protect the princess when he was in such a relaxed state. They must have at least his strength to protect the girl. Nikhil was aggressive because he didn't understand what this guy was talking about. Cage supported the prince, saying that it would be better to kick him out now. The guy stood behind the princess in bewilderment and asked how they could treat a guest like that. By the way, even though he is the emperor's advisor, he comes to Leona at the first opportunity. She would be more tender if he brought her gold or something, but all he does is talk nonsense and then leave. That is why our heroine concluded that the guy was simply a useless creature. Harriet at this moment looked at the princess with admiration and asked if she was angry. Our heroine wasn't particularly happy with him because she had already forgotten that this guy was also crazy. Harriet admired the princess, saying that she was so sweet even when she turned away. Leona never thought that she would end up being the most normal. In any case, she needs to grow up quickly. He also began to think about something strange, but still turned himself away from all these thoughts, thinking that now was not the time for this. Still, Harriet decided to tell the truth. He didn't come today to see the princess. He was here to tell the prince something. Nikhil was undoubtedly very surprised, so he even decided to ask again if it was really about him. The advisor thought for a moment and then nodded his head. He asked how he could spend all his time in the Black Rose Palace and what he would do if others found out about it. The guy, perplexed, said that everyone already knew this, and what's more, it was absolutely his business, so what difference did it make? Harriet smiled sweetly and told His Highness that if he did not watch what he said, his life would be very short. Our heroine, looking at this trio, could not understand the reason for their hostility towards each other, but she heard in passing that they did not like that she was often visited by guests. In any case, if this is the reason, then they do the same thing. Leona sighed heavily, thinking that people's feelings were very unusual. At this point, Nikhil was telling Harriet that he would probably die before him. The guy, perplexed, said that he was only 30 and he planned to live a long life. The prince asked if the advisor knew that walking on a thin thread significantly shortens life. Harriet smiled as he told the prince that he must not have known that the thinner the thread, the better it was for strangling someone. In any case, the boy turned to His Highness, asking him to realize that he was stronger than him. And yet Nikhil managed to lose this round, which left the guy upset. Our heroine sighed heavily because she understood that mental age does not matter. There is no way a 10-year-old boy can beat a 30-year-old. Nikhil decided to change the subject and asked what Harriet wanted to say anyway. Better to talk quickly and then get out of here. The advisor was certainly not particularly pleased with this attitude, so he suggested that he should not speak at all. Still, he sighed heavily and said that the day after tomorrow, there would be a banquet to celebrate the second prince's birthday. He explained that His Majesty had given orders for all who had received an invitation to attend. Nikhil sighed heavily and said that he did not want to go. Harriet immediately said that the prince had to be present since everyone would come. The prince exclaimed in bewilderment. He said in surprise that it could not be that this concerned the princess. The advisor smiled and said that everything was correct. Her Highness was not included in the guest list. The guy breathed a sigh of relief and then asked if his father would come to the banquet. Harriet asked irritably if he hadn't said that 3 times. It was His Majesty's order, and the prince apparently had the memory of a goldfish. Nickel, perplexed, told the advisor that he was indeed disrespectful to the imperial family, which meant that he would be the first to die when he became emperor. The guy smiled and said that he would be happy to run away before this grand event. Then he turned to the girl and began asking if she could give him a little attention. Our heroine simply couldn't stand all these questions. But in any case, she couldn't help but notice Nickel's expression, which was quite serious. The girl at this point decided that she should lighten the atmosphere a little, so she turned to her brother. The guy smiled at that moment and asked the princess what happened, why she was holding on to him so sweetly. Our heroine made mistakes in her sentence, but got the gist of it across. She wanted to go to the birthday party. Irina could tell from their faces that the boys weren't happy about it, but she still wanted to meet the imperial family. She wasn't going to miss such a great opportunity. Nickel started to get nervous and told the princess that she couldn't go because she wasn't invited. The girl, perplexed, told her brother that he could simply trick her. The guy fell to his knees and told Leona that he couldn't do that, so he wouldn't take her there. Our heroine gradually began to get angry, which is why she even began to ask why he couldn't do it. Harriet decided to join the conversation, telling the princess that this banquet would be dangerous, so it would be unwise to show up there. Nickel still agreed with the advisor because the second prince's banquet is really dangerous because this guy is just crazy. He looked at the upset princess and explained that this was no place for such a beautiful and sweet child like her. Even Cage agreed with them, saying that it was all true. In the meantime, they could go on a picnic together. Nickel convinced his sister that he would take her to a banquet next time, which would be safer. Our heroine wouldn't be a great witch if she gave up so easily now. She knew she had to know her enemies first, before she could get rid of them, but there were many people who knew Leona. That's why no one can kill her so easily. So now is the right time to observe the other princes and princesses and get to know them better. Our heroine was surprised that Nickel thought she would miss out on such a great opportunity. Despite all the words, she definitely set herself the goal of finding a way to get to the banquet. After some time, the action moves to the street. The guys had to go about their business. However, Nickel wasn't going to just go about his business, so he decided to call an advisor. The guy, perplexed, asked what happened, to which the prince offered to talk to him. Harriet almost fell over at the suggestion as the prince finally started the conversation. The boy asked him not to be mistaken, because what he wanted to talk about was only for the good of Leona. The advisor was very surprised by this, so he asked if there was something wrong with Her Highness. Nickel explained that she had told him this before. She had asked him not to mention the word love to her because she hated hearing it. The guy was surprised and asked if she really said that. She was only 3 years old, but how could she say something like that? The prince said that he was upset too, so he told him this now. In any case, he repeated that he said this only for Leona's sake and not for the sake of the advisor. Harriet thought about the prince's words at that moment. Why does Her Highness reject love? It seems that the absence of the 12th Empress had a great impact on her. Her Highness never received true love from her family. Her mother died, and her father never showed love. Rather, he encouraged conflicts among the children. The guy continued to think about this and the question of what to do with it. Nickel at this point turned to the counselor and asked if he should tell his mother about this. Harriet Ulizer raised his head in surprise and asked if the guy was really talking about the 4th Empress. The prince nodded his head and asked what would happen if he asked her to meet Leona. Harriet didn't really appreciate the prince's idea, so she asked in surprise why he was doing this. The guy explained that his mother might find her cute, and that they would get along. The advisor sighed heavily, because he didn't know what to do with those who looked at the world through rose-colored glasses. Nickel didn't understand what the rose-colored glasses meant, but he decided that it was definitely not a compliment, so he was unhappy. Harriet answered the prince that everything was true, because he was saying that the prince was a complete fool. The guy screamed in bewilderment and said that it was not true. And in general, he reminded what could happen. The advisor, in turn, said that he seemed to be forgetting the fact that he and Her Majesty were rivals. Looking at Nickel, Harriet asked if he was right. The guy sighed heavily and said that he knew about it. In that case, the advisor asked to explain why he went to the Black Rose Palace every day if he knew, because he was breaking the rules by having such a close relationship with Her Highness. It would have been stupid to ask his mother for such a favor, since it was unlikely that Her Majesty would be able to treat the princess the same way he did. Harriet concluded that he was categorically against this acquaintance because he would not want the princess to be killed. Nickel immediately screamed and used magic, asking not to insult his mother. Harriet calmly dodged the attack and asked the prince not to tell Her Majesty about all this. In this case, Nickel asked the advisor what he suggested they do, to which the guy said that he would try his best. The guy proudly said that he would simply give Her Highness all his love. Nickel sighed heavily, realizing that this idiot didn't understand anything at all. The action shifts to our heroine. She was standing near the flowers, looking at the huge palace. The girl thought that the roses were gloomy today, as always. Nickel told her that he felt sick every time he came here, and Harriet said that for her sake, instead of all those roses he would plant forsythia. And of course Leona forbade him to do these stupid things because she liked roses. The counselor's actions would be terrible, because where else could you find roses that fit this place so perfectly? The more she thinks about it, the more she realizes that they fit her. And still our heroine could not understand the reason for the appearance of mana in this place. This mana was surprising because even Cage couldn't sense it, which means only one thing. Something is definitely wrong here. In any case, our heroine decided that she would deal with this later, because it was not so important. Suddenly, our heroine used flight magic, and then soared into the air. The strange thing was that the girl didn't feel very comfortable. Perhaps she wasn't completely used to magic yet, but she didn't feel very comfortable. Still, if she wanted to move quickly, she had to be patient. Our heroine had to return to the banquet hall while the sleep spell used on Cage was still active. They had to act quickly because the spell would wear off in less than an hour. Irina was puzzled that everyone was against her presence at this banquet, but still, what could they do when she came there? That's why she needs to hurry, and then no one will even realize that she used magic. Then the girl looked at her hands and wondered when she would finally grow up and why this body was growing so slowly. Even a donkey can walk immediately after birth. So why do people need several years to do this? And what's more, even when they learn to walk, they cannot do it normally. The girl sighed heavily and decided that she would never get used to this weak body. How difficult the life of a witch is. Although her life is quite painful now, if she can survive this, then in a couple of years, better days will come. She encouraged herself with the thought that the day when everyone would bow before her would definitely come very soon. As soon as that day comes, she will immediately impose a ban on the use of the word cutie. She simply hates this word with all her soul. In any case, while our heroine was in her thoughts, she continued to fly. Suddenly, the magic disappeared. Irina landed on the ground and, to her horror, realized that she was lost. The girl began to get nervous because she didn't know where she needed to go now. As she fell to the ground, she began to go over the bad words in her head, thinking that she should have looked at the map before leaving. In any case, the fact remained a fact. The current situation was very bad, because at this rate she would be late for the banquet. If there were people here, she could ask them for directions to the banquet hall, but there was no one here, as if on purpose. Another thing that wasn't particularly pleasant was that the sun was gradually starting to warm up. Suddenly, our heroine noticed a huge field in front of her, littered with something incomprehensible. It was the glory of the great empire. Taking a closer look, the girl realized that these were silver scales that belonged to the old dragon Askina. Our heroine sighed heavily, thinking that she had tried so hard, but it was all in vain. This old geezer is very sloppy. Probably no one else would leave this mess. He would be scolded or even get rid of him. It would have been much more useful if he had brought the gold instead of doing such things. But in any case, she would not be able to get it since the dragon had fallen into hibernation. Suddenly, our heroine noticed something that was different from everything else. It was an active magical barrier. This barrier is so sensitive that if she gets close to it, a siren will sound. To her surprise, it will be quite difficult to remove. It is made more complex to protect what is inside from brute force. It seems to have been made by 4-star mages or higher. In any case, our heroine began to smile, thinking that for her this barrier was as easy as pie. She waved her hand and told it to go away. But something was wrong. It seemed to have been cleverly made and connected to another. Having finally understood the essence of the defense mechanism, our heroine bypassed the system in a different way and was able to dispel the magical barrier. Now that the barrier is open, it's time to go full speed ahead. The girl set off for the Empire's treasure. Sitting down, our heroine decided for herself that she would change everything here, and no one would stop her. And she did this not because this old dragon was revered here, but because she was bored. The girl was humming some positive song and continued to deal with the stones, not paying much attention to her surroundings. This was exactly her mistake, because she did not notice how someone snuck up on her and then asked what she was doing there. Our heroine realized that things were bad. Now all that was left was to hope that it was not the Emperor standing behind her. As soon as Leona turned her head, she noticed a puzzled Emperor standing in front of her. The girl immediately realized that things were bad, because now she would have to figure out how to justify what she had done. In any case, she decided not to show her fear, so she greeted His Majesty with a sweet smile. Usually, when she smiled like that, people clutched their hearts in emotion. But as she thought, it didn't affect the Emperor. It didn't look like the Emperor was emitting his magical energy, but for some reason, she was sweating too much. However, the man looked at the girl more and more suspiciously, which made it seem like the energy was becoming stronger and stronger. The girl continued to smile sweetly, but in her head there was only a feeling of déjà vu. The Emperor was already like this when they first met. He cast a long glance at her. After that, an incomprehensible action followed. He suddenly touched her hand and transferred the mana. And by the way, how Leona remembered how painful it was. And the moment when she bit the Emperor was hard to forget. The girl stepped back a little, hoping that the Emperor would not do it again. However, just at that moment, someone started running and screaming, calling for the Emperor. Our heroine had already heard this voice, because as soon as the guy ran up, it turned out that it was Harriet. The girl immediately began to smile and show her cute face. She was very happy to see him. In turn, the advisor turned to His Majesty in bewilderment and asked how he could do this to him. He said that they should go together and just wait. Scratching his head, he asked how the Emperor could just up and leave him alone. However, at that moment, he turned his head and was shocked. Leona, in turn, waved to him happily. The guy almost fainted because the princess looked at him and smiled. The counselor came up and said that whenever he looked at her, she was always so sweet and beautiful. Looking at her, he felt that he had fulfilled his life's purpose. And at that very moment, the guy slapped himself in the face, saying that now was definitely not the time for this. He needed to pull himself together. Our heroine was in shock, looking at this madman who was doing something incomprehensible. Nevertheless, the guy still decided to ask the princess what brought her here and where Cage went. Leona proudly said that she ran away, and Cage is now resting in the room. The advisor couldn't control himself. It was very cute when she couldn't pronounce some words, but what did she just say? The guy, perplexed, clarified that she had run away, so he decided to ask why Leona replied that she had come for a birthday party. The guy sighed heavily and asked if they hadn't told her earlier that she wasn't allowed to go there. He asked her to go back, or he could call someone. Suddenly, the advisor was interrupted by someone. The Emperor approached the boys and, pointing to the princess, asked who it was. Harriet fell silent in confusion because he didn't quite understand his question. Our heroine was no less shocked. What do you mean, who is it? The girl assumed that they were talking about her. The advisor, perplexed, began to tell the Emperor that this was his daughter. The man looked at the girl in surprise and scratched his chin. Harriet continued to say that she was the 12th princess, and he had told her to choose a sword many years ago. The Emperor, in turn, looked as if he didn't remember anything at all, no matter how hard he tried to remember. Our heroine was now in incredible shock. She didn't know what was wrong with this Emperor. He forgot about her? The advisor at this point, already in a slight panic, tried to remind him who it was. He said that the girl had chosen the necromancer Cage as her sword. And still the man didn't understand anything. Apparently, even Harriet's explanations wouldn't help here. Irina was very irritated by this, because she in turn thought about him constantly. Suddenly, the Emperor sighed heavily. Now when he looked into the princess's eyes, he remembered. Looking at her, the Emperor said the girl's name in the most cold-blooded voice possible. Our heroine immediately felt a strange magical power. Apparently, he pours mana into his voice when he says this. Is this a warning for her not to fool around? The girl assumed that he thought that if he did this, she would stop acting like a child. Our heroine smiled and proudly said that her name was Leona. She certainly wasn't going to fool around. Harriet Ulizer couldn't hold back his smile. At that moment, Irina looked at him and mentally told him not to laugh, because she had to survive, and she had no choice. And yet the girl said that she was going to a birthday party but got lost. So she sat here. Our heroine felt a cutie aura about herself. She acts like that even when she puts aside her witch pride, so she is a perfect cutie. Although, looking at the Emperor's indifferent reaction, maybe she's not such a cutie after all. He is the one who always gave her troubles until his death, so her body goes numb in his presence. In any case, she must be careful and not get nervous. Irina thought it would be nice if he showed a little fatherly affection when she smiled at him. He wouldn't have to kill her if he found out she was a witch, right? Of course it was. In any case, she had to win him over, even if only a little. Luckily for Irina, that body had an incredibly cute face. People can just die from too much cuteness, and she can definitely take advantage of that. Here's victim number 1 about to have a heart attack. Harriet at this point bent down on his knees and said that the Emperor was her father, and it would be good if she spoke politely to him. Our heroine smiled and began speaking again, skipping some letters. Emperor? The boy smiled back and said that it was true. It was his Imperial Majesty. The advisor asked the princess to try calling him father. Our heroine began to speak. She called him simply Pa, hoping that would be enough. Of course, the advisor corrected the little princess and said that it was correct to say father. At that moment, the girl screamed, saying Daddy. But something went wrong because the Emperor did not react in any way, and she tried so hard. Her enchanting magic worked on Harriet, but unfortunately, it didn't affect the Emperor. He's definitely not an easy man. And still, this only made our heroine want to defeat him more and more. At this time, Harriet was getting up from the ground, saying that his heart could not take it anymore. Leona turned to him and said that she wanted to go to the party, so she asked him to take her too. Crossing her arms, Irina used her cuteness skill to the max and asked her daddy to take her with him. Our heroine asked for this with her whole appearance. And could he really not take her, despite the fact that she behaved so sweetly? Soon came the long-awaited reply from the Emperor, who answered briefly, but clearly, no. Irina smiled proudly, thinking that he said it right, because no one in this world could refuse her, because she is so. Stop only now, did our heroine understand the words the man said. Irina even staggered back from such cold-bloodedness. How could he refuse her? After this, the Emperor turned to his advisor and said that they were already delayed, so they needed to go. Harriet wanted to say something, but now it would be considered treason to contradict the king. In turn, our heroine realized that she had just been abandoned. Looking at the Emperor's back, she couldn't even find kind words. How could he be so cold? In her eyes, he was an evil jerk. Irina was not about to accept defeat, so she decided to simply follow them. The girl began to speed up, and to make sure she was heard, she screamed, saying that she was coming with them. However, to her misfortune, there was a stone on the way over which the girl tripped and fell. Our heroine began to raise her head in bewilderment. The fall, however, was not a pleasant one. Harriet reacted to the princess's fall and immediately ran to her. The girl stood up and couldn't hold back her tears. She scraped her knees, and it really hurt like hell. When she was a witch, her physical abilities were unmatched. To think that she was bleeding from falling just from running such a short distance. Harriet ran to the princess, saying that he would take her to the healer right away so she could climb on his back. Our heroine waved her hand and said that she didn't need it, but she was still grateful for the help. She decided to return to the topic she had been talking about. She reminded him that she had asked him not to leave her alone and to go together. The Emperor suddenly asked a question that surprised our heroine. He asked if she was in pain. Irina was shocked. Was he really worried about her? Deciding not to miss the opportunity, she said that she was in pain. In fact, she was in so much pain that she wanted to fall to the ground and just start crying. But she had to hold on because the Emperor hates the weak. Even if she looks like a little child, she can't cry. She explained that she didn't want to cry, because Rin said that you can only cry when things are really, really hard. The girl hoped that she had answered correctly. Suddenly, a hand began to move towards her. Our heroine again expected something terrible, but the Emperor simply took and lifted her up. Holding her in front of him, he looked into her eyes and decided to ask how she had removed the barrier. And then thoughts started rushing through my head at the speed of light. I had to be calm, so as not to fall for such a provocation. But what to say? So many options, and our heroine, of course, decided to choose the option of the uncomprehending little child. The girl asked what barrier we were talking about. The emperor clarified his question. He asked how she had gotten into the gravel area. And again, the girl asked in bewilderment what he was talking about. Could he really be talking about those white stones? The emperor nodded his head. The girl said she had no idea how, because she just walked by and started collecting them. Looking at her father's puzzled face, the girl said that she had indeed just walked by. However, she began to talk about how she was really in a lot of pain at the moment. She started twitching and saying that she was in so much pain that it seemed like she was going to die. The man laughed at this point and said that it was true. She couldn't die here. Soon after, he lowered her to the ground. Our heroine was in incredible shock because something incredible had just happened. The emperor smiled after all. Immediately after the emperor put his daughter down on the ground, he turned to her and told her to follow him. Irina was proud of herself because she was still able to impress the emperor with her charm. She was now absolutely sure that no mortal could refuse. Her Irina happily ran after her father and Harriet. However, at that moment, the girl ran forward and, saying that her legs hurt, grabbed the emperor's cloak, asking him to take her in his arms. The emperor turned his head in utter bewilderment, making it clear that he did not particularly like this. Our heroine smiled, but her body was pierced by fear. What happened? What's wrong? In any case, she decided to repeat the question and ask if he would pick her up. The advisor, standing nearby, was sure that if things continued like this, the princess's head would fly off her shoulders. The guy started smiling and saying that he could pick up the princess in his arms and carry her all the way to the banquet. Our heroine turned around abruptly and said that she didn't want this, so she asked him to move away. She turned again to the emperor, saying that she could not walk unless he took her in his arms. At that moment, Harriet looked at the emperor and assumed that the princess simply missed her father's warmth. Taking out his handkerchief, the boy began to wipe away his tears, thinking that the emperor was very cruel. Our heroine kept holding her hands out all this time, wanting to be picked up, and little by little, she began to feel as if her hands were about to fall off. So much time had passed that Irina no longer had any idea why the emperor was just standing there looking at her. Still, she decided to ask directly why her father was standing there and doing nothing since her legs hurt a lot. Standing on trembling legs, our heroine begged everyone to finally take her into their arms. At that moment, the girl began to fall, which finally made the emperor come to his senses. Soon, Leona opened her eyes and was surprised that she did not fall to the ground. Soon she was brought to her senses by a voice that said that she was quite demanding. It turned out that our heroine had managed to achieve her goal after all she was in the emperor's arms. The girl began to speak joyfully and thank her daddy. And yet no man could resist her. Now that he had submitted to her, she needed to be carried into a bright future. Although the girl still could not believe that His Majesty had succumbed to the childish influence of the princess, Harriet Ulazar was also quite smiling, because he was glad that the emperor's cold heart was able to waver. After some time, when he came to his senses, the guy started running after him, asking the emperor to wait for him. The action moves to the banquet. The maids were watching everything around the food, the decorations, the atmosphere. Everything seemed to look wonderful. One of the maids was very worried, because the second prince was incredibly clean. Although, to be honest, the prince is simply obsessed with cleanliness. The girl turned to her assistants and said that more flowers were needed. The girls immediately nodded their heads and went to get flowers. Exhaling heavily, the headmaid thought that everything should be fine. However, a moment later, a disgruntled voice of a guy was heard, who said that there was simply incredible chaos here. The maid turned her head and noticed the second prince in front of her, who was already dissatisfied. The guy walked up to the table with disgust, and measuring the distance between the cutlery, said that they were lying unevenly. After that, he turned to the maids and reminded them that he had told them to make sure that everything went smoothly. The girl instantly fell to the ground and began to ask for forgiveness because she was truly sorry. She tried to explain this by saying that most likely the instruments were moved by the wind and they would now fix everything. The guy started folding the ruler and saying that the maid shouldn't even try to justify herself. At that moment, Nikhil appeared behind the second prince and asked her brother in surprise if it was his birthday today. That's why he said that you shouldn't torture people on your birthday. The guy sighed heavily once again and threw Nikhil's hand off his shoulder. Soon the prince turned his head to the maids and said that they were free. But in turn, the second prince turned around and shouted for them to stay put. Then Nickel said that they could go, and the second prince kept telling them to stay put. A real fight broke out. The boy asked his brother not to focus on this, and his father would be coming soon. Did he really want to appear before him covered in blood? The second prince was certainly unhappy that he was wrong, and Nickel supported him, saying that his father did not like all this because he loved order. With a heavy sigh, the second prince told the maids that they could go free this time. This was a real relief for the girls, so they thanked the Lord and began to run to the palace. Nickel laughed and told his brother that he could kill anyone with his gaze, but he better calm down, otherwise he would get stabbed one day. The second prince laughed, saying that no one would dare to do that except Nickel, of course. The guy laughed in response and sarcastically asked if he really knew his whole plan. The second prince smiled and said that it was not so interesting. He knew that Nickel often ran away and visited the Black Rose Palace. Soon the guy said that he really wanted to invite the 12th princess to his banquet. Nickel, perplexed, told his brother that he was just a psychopath and that he could kill him right now. The second prince began to laugh, saying that he should still try to do it. At that very moment, an earthquake began. All the maids began to run to the palace in bewilderment. The boy knew that when the first prince was not in the palace, he was the strongest here, but he could not ignore Nickel's power. He needed to destroy him long before he became stronger. However, his brilliant plan was ruined by one phrase from the butler. The guy shouted that His Majesty the Emperor had arrived. At that very moment, the princes stopped their battle and turned their heads. In front of them stood Harriet the Emperor, and also someone whom the Emperor held in his arms. Nickel said in confusion, "Bunny?" In response, our heroine smiled sweetly. The action is transferred to a few moments earlier. Irina thought that swordsmen really have a strong body. She clung to her father, thinking about one thought. Should she get everyone on her side? Looking at the Emperor, the girl assumed that this was certainly a good method. But at the same time, Irina was always alone, and she was happy with it. She was like that until her death. And yet every time she thought about her past life, she began to get angry at the memories. In her past life, she put all her effort into not bothering others, and in doing so, she got stabbed in the back. Only because of this, our heroine began to hate people with all her heart. Although, on the other hand, she was madly afraid of loneliness, which made it even more difficult for her. Our heroine certainly didn't want to die at the hands of a man, but at the same time, she understood that she was too weak. In any case, she had a huge knowledge base, although it was too small to use it all to its maximum. But she could still use the mana that was transferred along with her soul. But the impact would be too great, meaning her body might not be able to withstand it. These words mean that depending on her age, her body's limitations also vary. So it would be nice to have loyal followers who will help at the right time. This method was quite practical and simple, so Irina was going to follow it. The girl simply did not want to rely on trust in other people because it was unreliable. She needed to subjugate everyone with her overwhelming power, since people always obey the strongest. If she becomes a powerful empress with her own personal army, then it will be easiest for her to kill Lacuz. Suddenly, Irina caught herself thinking that the slightest thought about him irritated her, and yet she wondered how he felt now. She became curious about all the news about this state. The girl knew that she needed to find out the amount of time that had passed since the death of her previous body. Although judging by the Emperor's age, not so much time has passed. And again, Irina repeated this thought, realizing how sweet her revenge would be. At that moment, the voice of the advisor was heard behind her, telling her how much the princess wanted to go to the banquet. Irina did not understand why he was looking at her with such a look. At that moment, the guy began to be touched by the way the princess was looking at him. In his eyes, she was an incredible cutie. Our heroine, looking at the advisor, was absolutely sure that he was not right for her. And what's more, she was curious as to why the Emperor had hired this guy. It would remain a mystery to her for now. Suddenly, our heroine felt a flow of mana in the air, and that meant only one thing. Apparently someone was fighting right now. Presumably the first person was Nickel, but she couldn't understand the second one for a long time. Soon she felt even more mana, and finally recognized it as ice magic. It was a little surprising because ice mages are a rare talent on the continent, and moreover, it is an attribute of the Emperor himself. The girl began to turn her head, thinking that this was very interesting and therefore worth watching. She was suddenly stopped by Harriet, who said he felt an interesting flow of mana. Apparently, the princes were fighting. Moreover, at that moment, the emperor also grabbed the princess and began to twist her head. Irina was completely perplexed by the fact that at first, Harriet had blocked the entire view, and now the emperor had started doing something strange. She looked into his eyes and began to think about what had happened, because his gaze was not very clear. Harriet came up and told the princess that His Majesty was just worried that she would be affected by mana again. The boy asked if he was right. In turn, the emperor said that he was wrong. The advisor laughed and asked if he was sure. The man at that moment closed the princess's eyes and repeated that Harriet was wrong. Our heroine was very surprised. Did he really care about her? However, it was not so important. The advisor suddenly said that he had already told the princes that they must not fight outside the arena, but they did not listen. What could happen to the princess in that case? Our heroine, in turn, of course, only thought that she was much stronger than those children. Harriet continued to say that the princess was still too young and weak, so she needed to be protected from such dangerous places. Our heroine laughed, thinking that he certainly didn't know the meaning of the word weak. In any case, he asked if he would stop them. The emperor shook his head and said that it would be best to simply announce their arrival. Harriet Ulazur laughed and said that this was also true, because if they heard about the arrival of the emperor, they would immediately calm down. And so the action takes us to the moment when the butler announced the arrival of His Majesty. Our heroine was in shock, because at that very moment, she felt that the flow of mana immediately disappeared. Harriet turned to the princess and guessed that she was very scared. He finished the thought himself, saying that it couldn't be otherwise, because many people lose consciousness after feeling external flows of mana. He asked if it was worth calling a doctor. Our heroine took it as an insult, because it was just a fight between stupid children, and for a great witch, it was just nothing. However, at that moment, the emperor placed his hand on the princess's shoulder and began to press her. Our heroine began to flow like jelly. Apparently, the emperor was giving her a massage because her muscles were simply melting. The emperor smiled, looking at the girl who was relaxed, and then asked if she liked it. Soon the prince turned to his father and asked why he had come here with Leona in his arms. The guy screamed in bewilderment and asked if he had really decided to kill her. Our heroine even closed her eyes from such nonsense, and 2 hands were not enough to cover her ears. Of course, even Harriet couldn't hold back his laughter. So looking at the prince, he began to laugh loudly. Nikhil screamed in bewilderment and asked why he was laughing. What did he say wrong? The advisor, continuing to laugh, said that it was all obvious and his question was banal. However, at that moment, the second prince approached the emperor and asked his father to settle in. The man looked at the princess and told her to get off arena. In turn was thinking that he should first lower her closer to the ground. And again, the emperor stared at the girl without saying a word, which even scared our heroine. What was unexpected was that the emperor still thought the princess was cute. Still, he decided he shouldn't single out any of his children, so he simply dumped Leona. Our heroine shook herself off a little and thought that she would never receive tenderness from the emperor. The emperor suddenly began to look at his daughter with a drop of regret. Soon our heroine spoke up. She said that she didn't want her dad to leave, but if nothing could be done, then she didn't mind. But in return, she asked him to carry her in his arms next time. She asked if he would agree. All the people standing around were shocked at that moment, because not every brave man could say such words. And if he did, these were his last words. Suddenly, the man simply leaned over and poked the princess on the cheek, with a smile on his face. Apparently, His Majesty also treats her with sympathy. Nikhil at this point asked in bewilderment if his father really liked the rabbit. Harriet shrugged and said that it seemed so. The prince asked how much he loved her. The advisor replied that he could not compete with their love, but still Nikhil smiled and said that he was glad that they had something in common. But the second prince, at first glance, was not so happy that his father was showing love to this girl. At this moment, other children came to the banquet and looked at the whole situation. However, the second prince looked at the 12th princess and thought that her father was very careful with her. He was surprised that the emperor had been different before, but why had he changed his attitude towards her? The guy immediately began to wonder what would happen if he simply got rid of the princess. He assumed that his father was simply indulgent towards her. That's all, she couldn't change his principles. His father didn't interfere in their struggle for the throne. In that case, the guy decided that his father wouldn't blink an eye if one of them died. And even though he had plans for today, there was no reason why he shouldn't include killing the princess in them. At this moment, the butler began to speak, announcing that they were celebrating the second prince's birthday today. Suddenly, the prince noticed that the girl was looking at the fork too closely. The guy started to get nervous because he assumed that she realized that there was poison there. At this time, our heroine was thinking about how much she could get if she sold this silver fork. In turn, the second prince was nervous, thinking that it was simply impossible to recognize this poison because it was incredibly rare, which had neither color nor smell. At that moment, the girl began to hit the table with her fork, and the second prince became even more tense because the poison would become visible if it interacted with the surface. The guy noticed that the tips of the fork had already darkened, which only meant that the girl had already realized that there was poison there. At this time, our heroine looked at the people at the table and understood that all these children felt hostility towards her, and it was obvious, although she understood why this was happening, because they saw her in the arms of the emperor himself. But still, it did not matter at all. As she began to take the apple, she thought that she had decided to gather people around her, but it seemed that these were only people who were loyal and supportive of her. The girl certainly didn't want to waste her time on future enemies. Looking at the apple, she thought that she was hungry, so she decided to eat the apple first. Unfortunately for our heroine, at that moment, she dropped the apple because it was somehow slippery. At that moment, the second prince slapped the table and stood up, which surprised our heroine. The guy was in shock at this time because the girl even guessed that there was poison in the apple. Now he couldn't let her go just like that. A moment later, the guy started whistling, and a couple of seconds later, as if out of nowhere, hired killers appeared. The killers attacked the children, who did not understand what was happening at all, but one by one they fell to the ground. However, the second prince was not most interested in these pawns, so he ordered the archer to deal with the princess. Our heroine was shocked by such a celebration, but the prince thought that the 3-year-old princess would die, and that she had no chance to save herself. The boy assured himself that in this case, his father would still give him a warm look. Only when he looked at his father, he saw only disappointment, which is why he stopped. At this moment, one of the princes, perplexed, began to ask his brother why he was doing this to them. The emperor suddenly clenched his teeth. He knew for sure that there were assassins hiding everywhere. He had no desire to interfere, but he still grabbed the princess in his arms. The second prince was shocked by this act, because previously he simply could not allow such a thing to happen to anyone. The emperor explained that the princess could not fight, which meant she would not take part in the battle. The boy was very upset and said that he hadn't thought about it. But did his father ever talk about such a rule? Everyone has to grow up before participating in battle? Our heroine was in shock at this time, because if she can't fight, then she doesn't participate in battles. Only at that very moment she began to turn her head in horror, because she realized one fact. If she couldn't fight, then Nikhil was alone against everyone. Leona instantly started tugging at her father's coat, asking her dad to help Nikhil because he was going to die. The guy was truly fighting for his life at this time, although the battle was not particularly equal. Our heroine, perplexed, asked Nikhil for help, but no one answered her request. Harriet Ulizer at this point decided to explain that they simply could not interfere in the fight for the throne. In that case, our heroine wanted to know why her father saved her, because it was unfair. Harriet explained to her that this was all because her sword was not with her. The girl immediately objected, saying that Nikhil was also all alone. The guy sighed heavily because he knew the reason for this. He decided to say that Nikhil's sword was also killed. Leona now understood what the situation was like, but it was extremely disgusting for her. At this time, Nikhil defeated one of the assassins and asked the second prince to come out for a fair fight. Of course, a man who fights thanks to hired killers did not even want to think about a fair fight. Leona still kept begging to stop the fight because she couldn't let Nikhil die because he was part of the upcoming battle. She understood that her brother could die, and yet she promised herself that her brother would not die just like that. He would definitely survive. Our heroine realized that no one would help her, and this only meant that she had to act on her own, even though she had promised not to use her powers. And yet she decided that she would do it one last time, and very carefully, so that no one would notice. She wanted to at least give Nikhil a chance to escape. The guy didn't want to admit it at the time, but he still couldn't win this fight. He sighed heavily, realizing that he was going to lose consciousness, but he simply had no other choice. At least for the sake of his honor, he decided to strike at least one blow at this pathetic idiot. Using all his strength and transferring it into the blade, he ran into the final battle. Naturally, the second prince ordered his archers to open fire to kill. A huge number of magic arrows flew towards Nickel, which is why he finally decided to accept his fate. But our heroine didn't think so. She used fireball magic. Soon a huge explosion occurred. The flames were so strong that they engulfed the entire banquet courtyard, and the princes were in shock. Only at this moment did our heroine realize how wrong she was, because it was too loud and visible. She accidentally managed to use 3-star magic, although she only wanted to use 1 star. Leona had no idea why she did it for someone like this guy. However, Nickel was incredibly happy at this moment. He jumped up and turned to the rabbit. Coming a little closer, he said that she saved him, and the girl did not understand why he had not yet run away while everyone was distracted. And in general, why was he going to her? The guy sat on her knee and asked when she had mastered magic, and why he knew nothing. He would have found a wonderful teacher for her. Nickel smiled, saying that it was really cool that she was a mage too. The princess laughed and said that it happened by accident. She didn't even know how it happened. The guy sighed heavily and said that she was lying to him. The girl in turn asked him why he thought that. Nickel asked how she could use such a powerful spell. In that case, Leona replied that she simply repeated what she saw. And still shaking her head, she said that she had no idea how she did it. Of course, Nickel wasn't going to believe her, and until the very end, he thought that she was lying to him. At that moment, the girl decided to raise her head and look at her father, expecting to see an angry face there, but for some reason, she didn't understand. He looked so happy that it was even frightening. At that moment, the emperor stroked the girl's head and said that she had just done something incredible. The man immediately turned to the advisor and asked him to call Zeros here. The guy smiled and said that he would do everything. Our heroine, of course, did not understand which Zeros was being talked about, or who he was in general. At this moment, the emperor turned his head and said that the test date for the princess would need to be rescheduled. At this time, the second prince sat motionless on the ground in the midst of all the destruction he had caused. Soon the emperor turned around and thanked his son for the introduction. But still now, he had to leave them. Our heroine was shocked because the emperor did not even bother to show that he was worried about his own children. She didn't want to believe that he was so cold-blooded, but apparently that was exactly how it was. At this point, Harriet turned to the princess and said that she was simply magnificent. Leona was surprised that he was still there. The action moves to the garden. Harriet asks the emperor in surprise if he hadn't told him how amazing the princess was. He was literally sure that the girl could do something extraordinary, which meant that she really was the best. And yet he was left wondering how she managed to cast such a spell. At this time, the emperor was thinking that he had previously assumed that the girl had huge reserves of mana, but he certainly couldn't have expected 3-star magic at the age of 3. At this point, the advisor turned to the emperor and asked if he liked the princess and whether she lived up to his expectations. He decided that the problem was that the princess still had to win herself a place before the first prince returned. Looking at the emperor, Harriet asked if he would help the princess when the time came. The man sighed heavily and told the advisor that he was talking too much. At this time, Nickel certainly did not feel very well. Our heroine addressed him and said that he was wounded. The guy smiled and said that everything was fine because he received powers from the sun god. Irina was perplexed. Did he really think that the sun god was helping only him? She told him straight out that he looked bad. The boy stood his ground again, saying he was fine. He jumped up and down a few times and asked to look at him. Starting to walk forward, he demonstrated how he could walk, but only a moment later he fell to the ground. Irina sat down next to him in shock, hoping that the guy hadn't died by any chance. Suddenly, she raised her head and noticed that the second prince was standing next to them. Our heroine had no idea what he wanted, but it seemed he wasn't going to kill Nikhil. The boy wiped his face and guessed that the princess's name was Leona. Anyway, looking at his jacket, she noticed blood, and this only meant that Nikhil's attack had finally reached its target. The guy at that moment said that she saved him. He was grateful to her for her help. If it weren't for the princess's magic, Nikhil's attack could have punched a hole in him and killed him. The second prince concluded that she saved him and Nikhil, so he wondered why she did it. Our heroine was confused, because who saved whom? She saved Nickel, and he was just lucky. The guy assumed she just didn't like the fact that they were fighting anyway. Was that what she wanted to convince her father of? Irina didn't understand where the dialogue was going, because it was making the strangest assumptions. The second prince scratched his chin, saying that he had expected this. That was why the poison he had prepared had no effect on her. Our heroine was shocked that poison was waiting for her somewhere, and yet at that moment the prince said that it was his gift for her. He offered her his frozen hand. He was of course sorry that the cut was not as smooth as he would have liked, but he tried. In any case, he promised her that next time he would give her a perfectly severed hand. Our heroine was in shock, because a frozen hand is definitely the last thing she wanted to get. The action moves forward some time. The maid turns to the princess and asks if she is sure she won't go anywhere. Leona nods her head proudly. Rin sighed heavily and said that, in order to seal this promise, it would be better to promise from the bottom of your heart and seal it with a pinky agreement. Even though the maid repeated the same thing every day, the girl still decided to accept this agreement. Even though a week had passed since the prince's second birthday banquet, Rin kept an eye on the princess. Although it is very annoying, she still worries about her. Rin said that she cried when she looked for her all over the Imperial palace. Sighing, our heroine asked herself an interesting question. Since when did she start believing in people again? It was possible that the maid was not really worried about the princess, but about losing her job if the princess died. Our heroine heard that maids in the Imperial palace are well paid. Maybe Rin is looking after her, because he is afraid of losing a good job. At this point, the maid turned to the princess, suggesting that she did not like hearing the same thing from her. Leona exclaimed in confusion and asked where she got that from. Rin laughed and said that the princess took a long time to answer. She turned her head away in embarrassment, because she understood that now the truth was not really on her side. Nevertheless, the maid began to stroke the girl and said that he loved her more than anyone in the world. The maid didn't want anything bad to happen to her because a princess should live happily and joyfully. Anyway, the girl stood up and said that she would go to the main palace to get the budget. She asked the girl not to leave and to behave well. As soon as Rin left, our heroine went out into the garden and wondered, is what the maid said true? If you look at it that way, she was thinking that there was nothing to love her for. By the way, Cage was sleeping again at that time. Irina could think about her own things, even if it was not pleasant. She remembered that she had always been loved for something. For example, Jin loved her for her red eyes and hair, but after the experiment failed, he fell out of love with her. Likewise, Lakuz loved her when she helped him ascend to the throne, but when he no longer needed her, he simply killed her. At the moment, Rin also loves her, but only because she is a princess. In this case, the girl decided that there was no need to beat herself up for anything. It was better to hide her emotions and play tough. By the way, the girl was glad that she could use magic because nothing had really changed. Nikhil, in turn, lay bedridden from that day on and made no attempt to find her. That was the only change. Although Ivac sometimes came to her to give her his strange gifts, for example, a ring holder in the form of a finger. The girl sighed, thinking that fortunately he stopped coming to her after she turned him down many times. At that moment, while our heroine was immersed in her thoughts and looking at the black roses, someone appeared behind her and began to call her. The girl didn't hear anything, so she simply couldn't answer. But the guy ran up to the princess and pushed her, saying that she shouldn't ignore him. The boy, perplexed, asked the princess if she should answer when someone addresses her. He looked at the girl in surprise and wondered if this little child was really the genius magician who saved the fourth prince using a fireball. The boy simply didn't understand what kind of magic this 3-year-old girl could use. In any case, this is not to mention that even he couldn't create a fireball yet. For a second, he was the best fire mage in the Imperial family, but something was bothering him now. If the 12th princess really was a genius mage, then he decided to take that title even if he had to kill her. And again, he touched the girl, not understanding why she was not saying anything at all. The boy laughed, assuming she was scared. He told her that she didn't look like a genius mage at all, which meant she was spreading false rumors about herself. After there was once again no answer, the guy began to say that she had apparently gone deaf. Of course, our heroine was conscious. She was just thinking about how best to start the acquaintance. Using magic, she screamed and asked how dare he hit her. From such strong magic, the guy simply fell to the ground and didn't even have time to say anything. She then stopped her magic and told the guy to stop annoying her and just disappear. However, the boy took it as a challenge, so he raised his hand and used fire magic. He said he would fry her from head to toe until crisp, and then she would regret it. Looking at the girl, he assumed that she had no idea what she had just done, but he would destroy her because she was an arrogant brat. Our heroine began to laugh. Using another magic, she dispelled the prince's magic, assuming that he was challenging her by focusing on stupid things. Continuing to use her magic, the princess asked if this was really all he could do. The guy looked around in bewilderment and asked what it was. Leona smiled, assuming that this little fool didn't even know what a fire starter was. Irina laughed in her mind, because she understood that this boy thought he could threaten her, the most talented fire mage, with such a pale flame. Our heroine waved her hand and told him that this was called a difference in skills. The entire battlefield was engulfed in flames. The guy was extremely shocked at this moment, which is why, with horror in his eyes, he began to ask how she could use such strong magic. Only our heroine thought that for him, now this doesn't make any sense. And yet the girl understood that this child could not be considered a worthy opponent, so she had to be gentler with him. After all, she had no intention of killing this guy. Suddenly, our heroine felt something familiar. The girl felt a painfully familiar mana in the area, so she decided to remove all the fire, which caused the prince to be a little shocked. At that moment, the girl hit herself in the face. The guy, perplexed, began to ask what she had suddenly started doing. A moment later, the girl ran to her father, saying that she was being treated badly. She immediately pointed at the boy, saying that he was bad because he hit her. The guy sat on the ground the whole time and was in extreme shock, so he couldn't even say anything. Our heroine continued to use her charm, asking her dad to help her. With a heavy sigh, the man began to try to understand the whole situation. Leona decided to help him with this, so she pointed to her cheek and asked him to look at it, because it hurt a lot there. The emperor was surprised that the girl did not want to reveal her power yet, because as soon as she revealed it, she would rise to the top. Then why? The action moves back some time. Harriet approached the emperor and asked if he wanted to see the princess. He assumed that the emperor was worried about how much this poor child missed his father. The counselor asked the man if it had occurred to him that she might have wanted to be hugged because she missed her father's hugs. It was at this very moment that the emperor recalled the words of the advisor. Looking at those innocent eyes, he thought that she was pretending to be weak because she wanted his love. Leona still didn't understand why the emperor was just staring at her. One way or another, at that moment, the man lifted the princess into his arms, showing that he was nearby. Our heroine was surprised because she didn't expect that he could do something like that. After this, the emperor turned his head and addressed the eighth prince. The guy, perplexed, began to shout and make excuses, saying that he had done nothing. Looking at the calm princess, he said that she herself suddenly did it. The emperor, in a less calm voice, reminded him that he had previously ordered that no battles should be started without the presence of guards. That was why, looking at the eighth prince, he concluded that the guy had simply disobeyed his order. The guy instantly fell to his knees, saying that he was asking for forgiveness. Our heroine in turn said that she was in a lot of pain, so daddy should still scold him. If the emperor wants to punish his son, he must do it properly and not limit himself to just these words. The man was pleased with how his youngest daughter was disposed towards everything around her, so a fleeting smile appeared on his face. Soon he turned his head and told the eighth prince that he should be confined to his room. Looking at the boy, he ordered him not to leave there for a week, otherwise he would increase security. The guy began to look at the girl in bewilderment, who was clearly mocking him. After all, she was the one who threatened him the most. The eighth prince wanted to say something, but the emperor asked in bewilderment whether the boy had really decided to disobey his order. With a heavy sigh, the boy said that he would accept his punishment and carry it out. After some time, the emperor carried the princess in his arms and carried her somewhere. Suddenly, the girl thanked her father. However, at this moment, the emperor turned to his daughter and asked why she saved the fourth prince. After all, this is a brutal imperial battle in which they can kill each other without mercy. For example, the first prince was in power now. However, if this child is wounded in battle, he will not be given any help and the place will be immediately taken away. Our heroine smiled and told her father that she had to protect her people. Leona proudly said that she is going to build her own army, and Nikhil is part of that force. That's why she saved him, the emperor. then wondered why she hid her abilities. Soon after a short silence, our heroine asked in bewilderment if he had really seen everything. The answer was yes. This made things a little more complicated. The emperor asked the princess if there was a princess who prevented her from revealing her powers to others. The girl replied that since she was not strong enough to protect her people, she had to hide it. At this moment, the emperor looked at the princess in surprise and asked if she even knew the meaning of the word protect. The girl smiled and said that everything was simple. Not letting her people suffer was protection. With a heavy sigh, our heroine asked where they were going all this time. The emperor answered her that they were going to the main palace because she had to meet someone there. Our heroine was undoubtedly surprised because the emperor personally wanted to introduce her to someone. At this time, the man was thinking that, for some reason, he did not want them to meet. The action takes us to a mysterious guy who was sitting on a balcony and looking at the imperial courtyard. In turn, Harriet was near him. He knew that this man was the master of the Western Tower. This mysterious guy's name is Zeros. He's the one the emperor was talking about. Harriet sighed heavily, hoping that their princess wouldn't fall in love with his pretty face and let her guard down because of it. The advisor even thought about how to somehow prevent their meeting, at least for now. Still, it would be hard to find another mage skilled enough to learn their princess's power. He heard that Zeros had gone beyond the limits of human development. At that moment, the puzzled magician turned his head and noticed that the guests were already late. Harriet happily said that this was indeed the case, and then asked if he would like to go home. Zeros was surprised by these words, but soon after laughed and said that everything was fine. A few moments later, the emperor entered the room with the princess in his arms. The man apologized for keeping them waiting. Harriet joyfully went to His Majesty. After that, he turned to the princess and said that she was as beautiful today as always. Zeros, as soon as he heard the words about the princess, became a little interested. A moment later, he came almost right up to her and began to examine her. The emperor stepped back and asked the magician what he was allowing himself to do. The guy reminded him in surprise that they had called him to study the princess's powers, so he was trying to determine them. However, if the princess's talent is good enough to be his student, she can become one of them. Our heroine was very surprised at this point, so she started saying that it was strange. She asked what if she didn't want it. Leona said that she didn't like it and absolutely hated it. Harriet smiled and supported the princess, telling her to keep going. Looking at Zero's puzzled face, the girl was surprised. Becoming his apprentice sounded like nonsense, because then her identity would be revealed. At this point, Zeros reminded her that he hadn't said he would accept her as his apprentice yet. He still didn't know if she met his requirements or not. Leona laughed and asked if he really thought she might not be qualified enough. The guy smiled and said that he really was. At that moment, the emperor advised the master of the magic tower to step back a little, and our heroine said that it was not so important. She would not do anything because she did not need examinations. For Zeros at this point, everything sounded like a joke, because it was funny to watch the princess express dissatisfaction. Still, he decided it was time to have a little chat in private, so the guy used time binding. Harriet and the emperor only realized what had happened, but at that very moment they froze. They did not have time to react. Because of this, our heroine realized that this incomprehensible magician had just stopped time. Looking at Zeros, the girl asked in confusion what he was doing. The magician smiled and explained his actions by saying that there was something he wanted to ask the princess personally. Looking at the puzzled girl, he asked who she was and what she was doing. Our heroine became a little tense because she assumed that this scoundrel knew her. In any case, she decided to go to the last, so perplexed, she asked who else she could be, if not Leona. Zeros asked her not to lie. The girl asked in surprise if he was really saying that she was not Leona, since she had no idea what he was talking about. Soon the boy smiled and suggested that nothing terrible would happen if he stopped this magic and said something to His Majesty. Our heroine now knew for sure that he knew something. At this point, Zeros asked the princess to think carefully about her answer. He explained that in any case, even if he did nothing, His Majesty would soon dispel this magic. Soon he decided to ask his question. Ending their secret conversation without closing his mouth properly. Was this really good for the princess? The girl, perplexed, asked what and how much information he knew. The guy explained that the Hasis Empire received the blessing of Eskina, as a result of which all members of the imperial family of this empire began to have a common trait. Leona asked what this trait was. Zeros immediately replied that their soul colors were all the same except hers. The magician smiled again and asked the girl her real age. Our heroine, puzzled, said that she was 3 years old. Zero smiled as if he knew everything. And even more, he was surprised that she still hadn't given up on the idea of deceiving him. The guy took her hand and said that he had his own methods. If she continued to lie like this, Leona asked in confusion what he was doing. At that very moment, the guy said that he understood everything. She was about 300 years old, and her soul was imprisoned. Irina was shocked that he understood everything with one glance. This was an incredible shock for our heroine, because even the Emperor could not recognize her power. But Zeros asked her if he should help her. After all, he could separate her soul once he had a suitable free body. If she didn't like it, he could make the most of her current situation. Zeros extended his hand and offered our heroine to sign a contract with him. Our heroine sighed heavily, and nevertheless placed her hand on Zeros's. The guy smiled and said that it was a very wise decision. But our heroine was not simple, so she used the magic of an electric spark. And it's certainly not something deadly, but it was definitely sudden, which really surprised Zeros. The princess turned to him and said that she certainly did not need his help. The guy at that moment was more shocked by the fact that the girl was able to create cracks in the time barrier he had created. Our heroine finally asked him not to speak to her so condescendingly, because it was too arrogant an attitude from such a child. A moment later, the girl felt a piercing pain. As expected, she used a lot of strength for this body. Harriet rushed to the princess in bewilderment, asking if everything was okay, and whether he should call the doctor. The girl clung to her father and said that everything was fine. She had certainly had enough after this madman. And yet, looking at him, she did not understand what exactly amused him so much, and why he smirked all the time. Leona sighed, thinking that he was indeed much younger than she was. And this was an era of decline in which there was no respect for elders. At that moment, the Emperor began to radiate his magical power, asking the master of the magic tower what he had just done. Our heroine was shocked, because the Emperor did not even think about holding back his power. Doesn't he see that she is dying here? But looking at Zeros, he looked just fine. Unlike her, he won't die if this continues. The guy just said that he didn't do anything. The man said that he knew that Zeros had used time-stopping magic. The master of the magic tower said in surprise that he had been caught. However, looking at the princess, he suggested that the Emperor hide his power. Looking at the baby, he said that the princess might have problems. The Emperor sighed heavily and agreed with Zeros' words and stopped. Harriet immediately began waving at the princess to give her enough air. Our heroine was in shock because she was literally on the verge of passing away. In any case, the Emperor continued the dialogue with the master of the magic tower. He was curious about why it was necessary to stop time. Zeros smiled and said that he could measure the princess's magical power more accurately. This way, Leona was shocked. He was literally lying and not blushing. The Emperor asked why, if he was only measuring magical power, the princess was now suffering. Zeros guessed that the mana came out in an unusual way, since the princess's magical power was so amazing. However, juxtaposed to her incredible strength, it seemed that her ability to control her body was still not up to par. She needed a lot of practice. Irina was incredibly shocked at this point. She didn't understand what all this meant. And more importantly, she didn't understand what was wrong with her ability to control. However, at that moment, Zeros bowed down and said that he would be happy to help. The boy approached the Emperor and said that he should know how valuable the teaching of the master of the magic tower was, so he would take responsibility for the princess. But our heroine had her own opinion. She said that she was against it and didn't want it. She explained her words by saying that she doesn't like this guy, so she will go either alone or with Cage. Harriet said that they should respect her wishes, so she shouldn't be forced to do something she doesn't like. The Emperor also said that she doesn't have to do it if she doesn't want to. Zeros was very surprised. He looked at the princess and asked if she really planned to refuse him. The girl's answer was categorical. She did not want to be in class with this madman. At that moment, the guy started to say something important to the girl with his lips. He asked if he should tell her everything. A moment later, The girl announced that she had changed her mind and therefore agreed to take magic lessons. Zeros smiled at her. He told her to take care of him from now on. The action at this point shifts to Nikhil, who was finally able to get out of bed, but his back was still bothering him. At that moment, a maid started running towards him, telling him that his body had not fully recovered, so he should not move. The guy waved his hand and said that he hadn't seen the bunny for a long time. As soon as he saw her, his body would immediately recover, and he would be able to sleep. Soon, he began to wonder what the bunny might be doing now. After all, it might be quiet time now, and she would be surprised when she saw him, since he hadn't been to see her for a long time. However, at that moment, the guy noticed Ivak in front of him, who was sitting near the fence and watching someone. Nikhil approached the second prince in confusion and asked what had happened that he managed to sit there. Ivak asked him to be quiet. And again, Nikhil tried to ask the boy what he was doing there, but the guy did not react to his question at all and asked him to be quiet. Looking closely at where Ivak was looking, Nikhil realized that he was watching the guy. This fire mage was the 8th prince of Edom. At first glance, he was certainly not friendly. And again, Nikhil decided to look around, and only now he realized that they were right in front of the Edom palace. Suddenly, the guy frowned. He didn't understand what this bastard was doing now. Soon, Nikhil noticed a whole bunch of hairs around. The guy was shouting, saying that he would get rid of her. The boy was so angry that even his sword could not calm him down, although he advised the prince to calm down. The guy started screaming in confusion, asking the guard where he was when this little girl was pestering him. The guard explained that he was carrying out the orders that Edom had given him, and yet the prince asked who had told him that he could leave whenever he wanted. The boy continued to shout, "He told me to go and kill the 12th princess and then bring her head when I was done." At that moment, Ivak turned to Nikhil and said that they could be allies. They both didn't really appreciate what Edom was saying. Meanwhile, the action moves to our heroine, who went out onto the balcony and sighed heavily, thinking about how tired she was. She used up all her energy to calm down Cage and Rin, who were fighting over yet another stupid reason. And yet, thanks to the master of the magic tower, her head hurt even more. As for him, it was interesting what to do with him, because it seemed that he had not yet learned Irina's identity. The girl decided that for starters, it would be enough to simply avoid him as much as possible. But still, she would soon have to meet him again, and they both knew it. At that moment, the guy hung right over the princess and asked who she was talking about. Our heroine recoiled back, saying that he had frightened her. Looking at this guy, she didn't even know how long he had been here, because she didn't feel his presence at all. She was eager to grow up as quickly as possible. At this point, Zeros assumed that this expression was a tradition among the Imperial family. The guy laughed, saying that she was looking at him as if she were looking at an insect. It hurt him. Leona asked him to stop being so noisy and just leave. The guy shrugged and said that the princess was overstepping her bounds. There was something he was curious about, so he decided to come here and ask before he left, of course. Zeros jumped off the railing and asked the girl again who she really was. Our heroine asked in surprise if he really thought she would tell him the truth. The guy, of course, smiled and said he didn't believe it. In turn, he promised to look after her, and for now, he would remain by her side. Still, at this time, it would be great if they could become friends. But our heroine disappointed him by saying that this would never happen. She would never be his friend. Taking the princess's hand, the guy said that the time would come when she would find him. Soon he smiled and asked to take care of him from now on. However, at that moment, a loud bang was heard from behind. Cage approached in confusion and said that she saw an intruder in front of her. As soon as she noticed that the guy was holding the princess's hand, she took it as an attack. In just a moment, a huge number of blades were flying towards the bewildered Zeros. The guy jumped back sharply and exhaled heavily, saying that everything worked out. He then turned his gaze towards Cage and asked how she was able to attack him so suddenly. Grabbing the blade, Zeros split it with magic and said that if she did it one more time, he would not let it slip away. Nevertheless, our heroine decided to intervene in this duel, so she asked in surprise what they were doing here near her. The girl looked at Cage and thanked her, saying that she had done well. After that, the girl looked at Zeros and said that he had already gotten what he wanted, so now he apparently wanted to put on a show. The guy said he wouldn't be scared by words spoken by such a little girl. Leona told him to shut up, otherwise she would let him get to know her better. Zeros smirked and said that she could certainly speak very eloquently. Soon he started to fly away, but at the end, he said that he wanted to play with her a little longer. It was a pity, but it was time to say goodbye. The girl nodded and asked him to leave quickly. Zeros told her that in that case, they would see each other next week. Cage approached the princess in confusion, asking if she was hurt. The girl wondered why this guy seemed familiar to her. Where could she have met him before? One way or another, Cage still wanted to know who this intruder was, so she asked the princess who it was. Our heroine explained that this guy is from the Magic Tower, and he is teaching her. Cage was even more surprised by these words. Our heroine asked in bewilderment if she really didn't know what it was. The girl replied that she had never heard of a magic tower. Leona was even more surprised by these words, because not hearing about the magic tower was quite strange. In any case, she decided to say that this guy was crazy. Luckily, they had the same thoughts, because Leona immediately agreed with it. And yet the princess asked her if she really had not heard anything about him. Cage thought for a bit and said that this guy was strong, maybe even stronger than the king. Our heroine was even more shocked by these words, because it was too surprising. Cage started talking about how she remembered him from the battle in the past on the Imperial plains. This guy was very scary. Our heroine, as soon as she heard these words, began to think, because she remembered this battle. It was a battle that took place during the war between the Hazes Empire and a certain country in the east. And now this country is completely destroyed. Leona remembered that the empire had won a great victory by killing tens of thousands of enemies with just one force. Could that one force really be Zero's? Our heroine felt stronger after being able to use magic at will, but still it wasn't enough. And yet at that moment, Cage asked the princess if she could kill this guy next time. Our heroine, perplexed, asked why she wanted this so much. The girl reminded him that he was her teacher anyway, so there was no point in fussing, and it was already time to sleep. The action moves to the next day. Our heroine suddenly fell to the ground. It was time to practice with mana. The girl was glad that she could freely use her magic. It was nice that she didn't have to hide and could practice calmly at the same time. The girl still knew that her suffering would be long, because if this traitor Lacuz had not treated her this way, then this would not have happened. In any case, our heroine was absolutely sure that in 10 years she would cut off his head. However, even if the mana hidden in her body was 5-star level, it would be difficult to increase the circle with such an imperfect body. That's why, in case something happens, she will have to find another room where she can use magic without hindrance. For example, to bring mana into her soul. At this moment, our heroine noticed that Cage was actively chatting about something. She remembered that she asked not to let anyone in. At that time, Ivak came to the threshold, saying that he wanted to treat the princess with sweets, but Cage still forbade entry. Our heroine was surprised that Ivak came here. The guy at that moment asked in bewilderment whether he was really asking for too much, because he just wanted to eat sweets with his sisters. The girl didn't understand what this guy wanted, but she didn't really want to know, so it was better for him to leave. However, just before she turned around, she realized that the boy was also a wizard. She had a hard time figuring out how to hide her skills, but she did it, and it looks like a great job. At that moment, our heroine approached the gate and called the guy. Seeing his tortured sister, the guy was a little surprised. The guy asked in confusion if he should give her some water. Our heroine exhaled and said that she didn't need anything like that. Immediately after this, the girl smiled and invited him to fight together. Ivak was shocked by his sister's proposal, so he hurried to stop her. The boy pointed to his basket and said that he did not come to fight with it. He explained that he had come to see her one last time before leaving the palace. Our heroine was very surprised by this, so she decided to ask why he was leaving. He sighed heavily and reminded himself that he was now 12 years old. At that age, all members of the Imperial family leave their palace to train their magic and powers. Just as Roderick was involved in the Northern Demon War, Ivak was planning to join the war on the western border. Our heroine assumed that if he was talking about Roderick, then most likely he was talking about the first prince. Thinking about it, the girl decided that this was precisely why she had never been able to see him. Ivak continued to say that when he left the Imperial palace, they would see each other for a long time, so he came to spend a lot of time with her. That's why he was trying to convey that he wasn't going to fight her. And what's more, she's already younger and smaller than him, so he didn't even think about it. Our heroine suddenly said that she couldn't wait to see how strong he was, so she wondered why he didn't want to have a duel. She assumed that he was afraid of being scolded by the emperor, but this time he would not be able to do so. However, the guy said that this was not even the problem. In this case, the girl asked what his problem was. The guy sighed heavily, and lowering his head, said that she was weaker than him. That's why, looking at such a cute princess, he simply wouldn't fight with someone weaker than him. And again, the guy said it would be better to go back to what he wanted. He brought sweets, so he suggested together. At this point, the princess interrupted him and asked what would happen if she did win. Ivak looked at her in bewilderment and said that this definitely would not happen. Spreading her arms out to the sides, our heroine told him that these were just words. The guy sighed heavily and said that if she did win, he would fulfill any of her wishes. Our heroine then proudly said that he would do everything possible to win. Soon the gates to the training field were closed, which meant there was no way to escape. Ivak was only surprised by this, because the princess had made a trap for herself. At that moment, the self-confident guy began to cast a spell to summon his magic. Only at that moment, our heroine had already rushed forward and was near the prince. The girl soon waved her hand and delivered a precise blow along Ivak's body. The guy didn't even have time to understand what had just happened. The second prince jumped back sharply and began to rise to his feet. He certainly hadn't expected this turn of events. At this moment, our heroine was a little upset, because she was aiming straight at the head. Ivak, in turn, was shocked that the princess seemed to teleport and over such a distance. Our heroine smiled and reminded him that he shouldn't let his guard down. Soon after, she waved her hand and used the earthquake technique. Instantly, the entire battlefield began to crack, forcing the prince to retreat. As soon as he had a window to attack, the boy decided to summon ice spears, hoping to end the fight. Of course, all of these spears headed towards the princess, as one making it seem like this was the end of the battle, but Leona used the flash at the same moment, causing a loud explosion. Once the smoke settled a little, the princess became visible, standing in the middle of the fire like a Terminator. The guy was undoubtedly in shock, but at this time, he still needed to defend himself from the attack. Once he repelled the attack, he had time to wonder, did Leona just use 4 elemental magic? Putting these thoughts aside, he decided that this was just some kind of nonsense. At that very moment, the guy decided to cast an icy fog over the battlefield. Looking at his surroundings, Ivak knew that all he had to do was freeze the princess's legs, so now he would tie her up and attack. Our heroine once again used the fire skill, the firewall, and thus easily repelled the prince's attack. Soon the girl flew into the air, saying that he was too close to winning. The boy refused to believe what he saw, but apparently the girl was blessed by the dragon. However, while the guy was deep in thought, our heroine turned to him. The girl asked in bewilderment, was that all he could do? She expected more. Ivak was shocked, so he began to question his sister. He was curious how she could use such powerful magic. The girl smiled and said that it was a secret. He didn't think that she would tell him straight out that she was a witch, did he? In any case, our heroine assumed that he lost. Is she right? Ivak looked at his hands and wondered if he should continue the fight. Even if they continued the fight, did he have a chance of winning? The guy was sure that he didn't have a single chance, so he still admitted that he lost. Our heroine was very happy to hear this, because it all meant only one thing. With a snap of her finger, she removed all the magic that was on the battlefield. Soon after, she landed on the ground and began walking towards her brother. Unexpectedly, our heroine extended her hand to him and said that he was now her subordinate. The guy asked in bewilderment if she really wanted to make him her servant. The girl nodded her head and said that he would be the #1 servant, because the loser must follow the winner's orders. The guy, of course, was shocked, but still decided to admit that she was right. In that case, our heroine decided to give him the first assignment. There was a task that he had to complete. The guy asked what kind of sudden assignment she was talking about, and he was curious about what she was drawing on the ground. Our heroine explained that she fully understood that he was going to leave now. However, although she did not know his destination, she hoped that he would go where she said. The boy suddenly turned pale because this drawing was very familiar to him. This is the kingdom of Carell. The girl asked to go there and find out what it was like, and then come back. She wanted to know how Lakuz the king was feeling. Ivak was initially shocked and didn't understand what it meant, but now he understood. She just didn't want to get her hands dirty with blood. Our heroine didn't understand what he was talking about, so she asked for an explanation. The guy in turn began to say that killing the king and returning was a very cruel request, because then he would also die. Ivak sighed, saying that he thought she was different from the other members of the Imperial family. But as expected, she was exactly the same. The guy summed it up, killing King Carell. Isn't that a call to action? Our heroine was in shock, so after listening to him, she asked what kind of nonsense he was talking about and why he needed to kill him. She repeated her request to find out what kind of kingdom it was, and then return. That was all she was interested in. The boy asked in bewilderment if she really didn't mean that he should secretly enter there and kill the king. Of course, the girl confirmed these words. Is Lacuz ruining his country because of his bad character, or is he trying to restore it by putting on a peculiar mask? Either way, she must find out. This was the only way she could work out the whole plan. In any case, the girl soon said that she would kill the king. She asked her brother not to do something stupid, because if he tried to do something like that, he would simply die. Ivak covered his face in bewilderment and asked the princess why she was interested in the state of Carell. Our heroine, perplexed, began to ask why he needed a reason, because it was an order. Since he had become her servant, he should not ask unnecessary questions. If he didn't want to follow the order, she suggested that they play together again. The guy, in shock, began to talk about how surprising it was that she was honoring the loser. Barely holding back tears, he said that she really considered him her man, and that meant that she was generous. Ivak proudly said that he would fulfill her order perfectly, so that she would be satisfied. Soon after, he thanked the princess. Our heroine, slightly perplexed, agreed with her servant. Although the girl did not know what the prince was grateful to her, for one thing was still decided. Meanwhile, the action moves closer to the magic tower. Near it, there was even a monument dedicated to Zeros. At this time, the master of the magic tower was bored, thinking that nothing was happening around. The guy decided to lie down on the bed, thinking that even the mages were so useless that he had to kick them out of the tower, although he should have left a couple of people. He thought that he was really tired of killing monsters, and in any case, there were no monsters left to kill. As he tossed the dice up, he kept asking himself the same question. He wanted to know how to get rid of boredom and still find something interesting. So he decided to think, for example, about the 12th princess, who had unprecedented abilities, as well as the reincarnation of the soul. Zeros wondered, has anything like this ever happened in the history of the continent? He had never heard of such a thing, except when dragons tried to relieve their boredom. But if so, then is the princess really the dragon seed? If so, then the girl was different from them, which was very strange, because she was somehow unusual and full of the desire to kill. At that very moment, Zeros jumped up from the sofa, thinking that he had thought about the princess and suddenly wanted to see her. She was very sweet. She spoke incoherently and swore constantly, so much so that he wanted to pinch her cheeks. He decided that tomorrow he would go and find her, but now, unexpectedly, a guest came to visit him. The guy suddenly got up from the bed and, slightly bowing his head, began to greet his guest. Looking at the ruler of the Carell kingdom, Zeros said that they had not seen each other for a long time. The action shifts to Ivak, who in the meantime was trying to get into the castle. To his surprise, there were too many barriers here, which made even him think that it was the magic of the dead. However, a moment later, there was an explosion, and the prince found himself inside. Ivak laughed, saying that only fools would cast such weak protective spells. Nickel looked at his brother in bewilderment and asked what he was doing there. The guy also asked why Leona didn't come, but only this traitor brother? Ivak, nevertheless, asked Nickel to repeat what he said about Leona. The boy, confused, began to ask what he was talking about. The second prince began to approach and say that, for Leona, he was just one of the members of the Imperial family. Nickel was incredibly angry at this point, which made him hope that his brother would get out of there as soon as possible. Ivak proudly declared that he had recently handed over the 12th princess to his subordinates. That's why Ivak told his brother to envy him silently, but of course he couldn't leave it that way. Soon there was a huge explosion. Meanwhile, the action moves to our heroine. The girl told Rin that she wants to go to the library, and Cage will go with her. The maid smiled and said that she did not mind, but reminded the princess to keep her promise. The girl began to smile and say that she would definitely keep her word, and everything would be fine. In that case, Rin wished the princess well and asked her to be careful. After some time, our heroine turned to Cage, asking why she wasn't talking to her Yi. It was strange that the girl avoided eye contact, answered briefly, and looked strangely. The girl started talking about being a sword. Irina was surprised, as if she hadn't known this before. However, at that moment, the girl said that she would not be greedy precisely for this reason. All these words of Cage left even more questions, so not understanding what kind of greed they were talking about. Our heroine said that she did not quite understand what they were talking about. The girl began to speak her thoughts shyly, one word at a time. But if you put the puzzle together, something was connected with envy and the second prince. Cage finally said the gist of it. She was shocked that the second prince had become the princess's subordinate. Our heroine looked at Cage in bewilderment and asked if she really envied the second prince. The girl remained silent, and silence, as far as everyone knows, is a sign of consent. The girl asked her not to envy her because he was just a servant, but Cage in turn was her protection, and she was not going to use it. Looking at the puzzled Cage, our heroine asked if she understood everything. At that moment, the girl proudly began to repeat the same thing, protecting the Princess Leona, was even upset at the moment that she said that. However, at that moment, the girl turned to the princess and said that she was very happy. Our heroine at that moment again felt that strange feeling, which was actually pleasant. After some time, the action moves to the library. Our heroine was just looking for the necessary books. At the same time, there was not a single book about the kingdom of Carell. At least it was written only that it was a country of criminals. How much time has passed since her death, and so many different books have already been published. For example, this book is only a year old. The 32nd issue will be published soon, which means that she died 27 years ago. And of course, plus 5 years in the princess's body. She still hasn't found any information about the kingdom of Carell, even though it's been 5 years. The Empire and Carell have severed all ties, apparently. Our heroine wanted to take over the kingdom, using the power of the Empire, but now she can't even do that. The girl looked at the book and realized that she had to change her plan. She would have to become stronger if nothing worked, and Lacuz had gotten stronger in the last 5 years. He's been obsessed with collecting mana all this time, but he's hardly the first one on the continent to reach the 9th level. In order for our heroine to defeat him, she had to be stronger in any case. Maybe our heroine needs to get more power than just witches. Suddenly, a guy appeared behind her and asked the princess what she was reading. And again, Zeros's appearance was so sudden that the girl almost slipped and fell. The girl asked in bewilderment why he was doing this so suddenly, and then asked him to let go. The guy laughed and said he just caught her so she wouldn't fall. Why be so rude to him? In any case, he asked if he should greet her again. After all, he would disappear suddenly, as well as return, but our heroine clearly smelled a scent that she could not confuse with anyone else. The girl used an electric lasso, which she used to pull Zeros closer to her. Looking into the eyes of the master of the magic tower, Leona asked if he had ever met this idiot. The action is transferred to the past. Standing over the girl, Lacuz held a blade, saying that she herself told him to kill everyone who irritated him. Our heroine never forgot that smell. The smell that did not leave her, even when her heart was pierced through and through by a sword. Sitting over Irina, the boy said that this continent should have only one ruler. That's why he asked not to forgive him. The sword Lacuz, which he controlled, smelled of betrayal through and through. All the memories flew by. The bright roses, the evening ball, where he said how glad he was to meet her. The marriage, where he swore he was happy. In the end, it all came down to him, talking about how much he loved her. At this point, our heroine returned to the real world. The girl realized that she needed to explain herself. Looking at Zeros, she realized that she had attacked him too suddenly, so she didn't even know what to say. The guy, perplexed, began to apologize and say that he didn't know that she had an increased sensitivity to dog hair. Our heroine was shocked. She didn't understand how long this wool had been flying around here. Anyway, the guy was talking about how on the way here, he saw a really cute dog, and so he stopped to cuddle it. Zeros asked if he needed to change clothes. Our heroine suddenly caught herself and screamed in bewilderment, asking who would come to meet her with dog hair. Soon after, the girl sneezed, but this sneeze was really unnatural. And again, our heroine began to sneeze over and over again. Zeros sighed heavily and said that he understood, so he would go and change his clothes. He instantly changed his outfit with a wave of his hand, so he decided to ask her if she liked the outfit. Our heroine asked in confusion what kind of magic it was. Zeros explained that he used polymorphia. It is convenient to use when you need to change your appearance. The master of the magic tower asked if it was necessary to tell how to do it. Our heroine understood that he could use dragon magic despite the fact that he was a human. Of course, the girl wanted to know how he does it, because she also wanted to try dragon magic. However, he decided to destroy all the princess's expectations, because he said one phrase, "I don't want to." The girl sighed and said that he was a stupid magician. The boy laughed and said that he would consider it a compliment. In any case, he decided to ask what interesting thing the princess was doing. Seeing books about Carell, the girl decided to ask if he had ever been to Carell. The guy said in surprise that he had never been there, and he didn't particularly like the place, which was full of rude people. But he had met people from there, and more than once. Our heroine was surprised, but she understood that she was on the trail, so she asked who he saw and why. Zeros was surprised that the girl was so interested in the kingdom of Carell. The girl told him that it was only because she would become Empress. The guy smiled and said he understood, but in that case he was wondering why Carell. The girl looked at Zeros and said that there was something strange about him. The magician looked at her in surprise and asked what it meant. She explained that in such a short time, they had managed to become such a developed country without doing anything and without starting a war. Everything was quiet and calm. She assumed that these people were hiding something. She definitely felt it. And yet it wasn't just empty talk. She thought it was really strange. A new state that didn't even assert its rights on the international stage. It was surprising that they were so quiet. The girl knew that there was something behind this, but in any case, she had to deal with this hopelessness. Zeros was lost in thought at this point. Our heroine asked him in surprise what he was thinking about while he was next to her. The guy asked to give him a little more time, because he was thinking about what to choose. The girl asked again, puzzled what this meant. She assumed that he was now choosing between her and the Carell state. The guy laughed and said that this was indeed true, because if he made the wrong choice, then only he would suffer. Our heroine was losing her mind with every moment she was near him. She screamed, saying that he was stubborn as a ram. The girl started to tug at him, saying that everything was too obvious. She would win because she always wins. The guy scratched his head and then nodded. Leona asked in confusion what kind of reaction this was. Did he really think she would lose? Zeros decided to ask how old the princess was. The girl, through gnashing her teeth, said that she was 3 years old. The magician smiled and said that everything was correct, which is why it was hard to talk about her victory. In any case, even if she said that she would become stronger, it was impossible to give any precise answer. And there was always one small problem with that. Our heroine asked in surprise what problem he was talking about, what kind of skeletons he had in the closet. The guy smiled again and said that the problem was money. He was an extremely mercantile and greedy person. Leona was surprised, so she asked him again if he really liked money. The guy asked in surprise who could not like money. The girl laughed and said that was true too. Soon she stood up and started saying that she had a lot of money. Zeros laughed and said that he believed her. Our heroine was unhappy because the guy continued to laugh for no reason. The girl asked if he really didn't believe her. The guy smiled at her and said that he was getting more than anyway. At that moment, the girl snapped her finger, and at that very moment, gold coins began to fall from the sky. In a few moments, the entire ground was covered with gold coins, which meant that now Zeros had to decide. At that very moment, the guy fell to his knees, and coins continued to fall from the sky. At that moment, the guy smiled, and looking at the princess asked if she didn't mind that he was 200 years older. In any case, he assured the girl that he would diligently help her. Looking at all the gold, the princess asked Zeros if he wanted to have it all. The guy started smiling and saying that asking such obvious things was simply not worth it. In that case, the girl said that if he swears allegiance to her, then all this will become his. Zeros began to smile and say that everything would be as she wished. However, our heroine said that this would not be enough for her, because she was talking about the oath of the magicians, an oath in which wizards put all their mana on the line. Zeros was still a little embarrassed at this point. The guy reminded that for magicians, mana is simply like life, so no matter how much he loves money, life is worth much more. Our heroine at this point began to smile and ask what if she just raised the fee. Zeros, with his hand on his heart, said that all she had to do was give the order, and he would do whatever she wanted. Irina mentally laughed at how simple he was. But in the end, she said that she would only say the terms once. Firstly, any important issues should be discussed only in private with her, and he has no right to tell a single soul about their conversations. Secondly, he must remain at her side until she becomes Empress. And thirdly, he must come at her first call. The guy started smiling and asking if she really loved him that much. Leona sighed heavily and asked her not to say stupid things. In any case, there was a fourth point. He had to maintain relations with the kingdom of Carell. Zeros was very surprised and asked if the princess was really talking about him spying for her. The girl said that he was undoubtedly right. If he kept the terms, she would be happy too. The guy, perplexed, began to ask if that was enough for her. Leona asked him what else he could offer her. Zeros smiled and said that he was still curious, but that would be enough for now. And by the way, she is the first one to use the owner of the magic tower as a spy. The princess asked in surprise if she really should add money. The guy instantly became obedient like a dog and said that he would spy as much as necessary because it was a mere trifle. Leona was both pleased and surprised at how simple a person this Zeros, the master of the magic tower, was. The guy said in surprise that it seemed to him that she was looking at him strangely, although it was not that important to him. The guy asked how long their oath would be valid. The girl said that she was signing a contract with him until she became an adult. Zeros decided to clarify, assuming that he was talking about coming of age. Our heroine nodded her head. The guy laughed, saying that he thought their oath would last forever. Leona asked in bewilderment why she would keep such a splinter near her for so long. This time would certainly be enough for her. The master of the magic tower bowed his head and said that in that case he would faithfully fulfill her wishes. Soon he raised his hand and began to spread magic that hung over the entire library. Our heroine extended her hand and a seal appeared on it. The funny thing was that she had once made a similar oath with Lacuz. The girl looked at her hand in bewilderment and chatted about her own things, and Zeros, looking at her, thought that at such moments she reminded him of a child. At that very moment, our heroine raised her head and asked to tell her what was happening with Carell. Zeros said that he was indeed up to something, but there was no need to worry because it did not concern the Empire. Because now the king was aiming at the southern lands. Since the Empire is in the east, Carell shouldn't be concerned about this place, so it's worth thinking about. Our heroine went into overdrive at that moment, as she began to think about various plans. At that very moment, she jumped up and asked in surprise if the Fire Witch's mountain range was by any chance located there. The guy said in surprise that it was really there. But so what? Of course he didn't know that this mountain range was her mountain range. The girl was confused, because it was her territory. She started saying that she couldn't go there because the witch was very creepy. However, at that moment, Zeros made her happy by telling her that there really was a witch living there once, but now she was dead. Our heroine clenched her fist tightly and asked how he knew this information. The boy told the princess in surprise that everyone had known about this for a long time. He explained this by saying that King Carell had spread the news across the continent that he had personally killed the witch. That's why it wasn't a secret to anyone. And what's more, he was surprised that she hadn't heard about it. Our heroine, in turn, took this information like firewood and added fuel to the already large fire called Lacuz's Revenge. The girl at that moment said that one only had to wait until she became Empress, and then the first thing she would do would be to raze Carell to the ground. In those seconds, the guy clearly understood that the girl really hated Carell. Suddenly, the girl began to ask what she should do now, because the oath had already been made, and it was impossible to return the gold. Zeros was surprised by her words, because he did not understand what this question was about. The gold really cannot be returned now. The girl smiled and asked what they should do now, because he could not return a single coin. Then she looked at Zeros and said that she wanted to say that they just weren't her coins. The guy froze at that very moment. Leona explained to him that all this stuff did not belong to her, but to Eskina. Absolutely all the coins. That's why she decided to clarify that if he spent even one coin, he would be finished. However, she asked him not to worry because she would pay him every month. The girl hoped that 10 gold pieces would be enough for him. Zeros didn't understand what was happening until the very end, so he hoped that it was all just a joke. However, at that moment, the girl opened the mirage and began to say goodbye. After all, she should have thought with her head before signing contracts. Soon the girl ran away, but Zeros was left alone with a whole bunch of gold coins, which he could not even touch. His scream sounded throughout the kingdom. Sometime later, at a late hour, our heroine was walking in an unknown direction, holding a bunny in her hands. She really wanted to sleep. Leona asked the maid if she could take a nap first, but the girl said that the fourth prince was waiting for her. She explained that if she was late, the prince would be upset, and good princesses keep their promises. With a heavy sigh, the princess said that she would go there, despite the fact that she might fall asleep. Rin began to smile and asked the princess why she was so obedient. Leona proudly asked, how could it be otherwise? However, at this moment, our heroine noticed that the palace was gloomy as always, a wonderful feeling. Looking around, the girl clearly felt a flow of energy, which was very pleasant. In that case, Irina assumed that her mana would increase even faster. This means that our heroine should live happily ever after in this palace. After some time, our heroine finally reached Nickel's room, who attacked her with hugs. The guy asked the bunny why she was late. Had she really been to the library again? He had been waiting for her for a long time. The girl sighed heavily and sat down on the sofa, and Nikhil asked her what she was doing there. The princess answered that she was just reading books. Of course, she didn't tell about another thing, for example, that she brought trouble to Zeros. However, the fourth prince was shocked that the rabbit could read. Rin said at that moment that the princess was really good at reading and writing. Nikhil was surprised by that. Looking at his sister, he told her that she was simply a genius. He simply had to write about this to the fourth sage. The maid looked at the prince in surprise and asked if he was serious. Nikhil asked the girl why she was surprised. Couldn't he do something like that for Leona? Rin bowed and began to thank the prince, and he in turn began to say that it was just a small thing. At this point, the maid placed cocoa on the table, which the princess loved so much. However, she warned that it was hot. Nikhil looked at Leona's nanny, and you could tell he was a little jealous because all his nanny knew how to do was complain. He was only glad that Rin was a good person. At that moment, the girl told the prince that, thanks to him, the princess was okay. Our heroine started drinking cocoa and casually said that she was right. And still, even if Nikhil brought 100 wise men, she would be smarter. Although if you think about it, there was one sage with whom she could not get along. In any case, she distracted herself from these thoughts, because this sage had most likely died long ago. At this point, Nikhil decided to ask the question that had been intriguing him so much. He was curious as to why she had made Ivak her subordinate. Now the princess understood why Nikhil had appeared so suddenly. In any case, the guy was saying that Ivak was not worthy of this honor and could not be trusted. Moreover, he decided to remind her that the second prince hated her and even tried to kill her. Leona asked her brother in surprise what he meant by that. The guy thought for a bit and then asked why she chose Ivak and not him. The girl looked at him and asked if he also wanted to become his subordinate. The guy started to get indignant, saying that he really wanted it, because why could Ivak do it and he couldn't? Did she really think he was weaker than this fool? Leona was shocked by such questions, because the answer was obvious. He just hadn't fought her yet. Our heroine wanted to tell him something, but at that moment, Nikhil interrupted her and said that he understood everything. The girl continued to drink her cocoa, and at the same time was interested in the prince's thoughts. The boy suddenly admitted that he was still weaker than his brother. The surprising thing was that he could agree with this, and yet he assured the princess that this was only now, and in the future he would become much stronger. After the members of the Imperial family grow up, they go through the ritual and become much stronger than before. So when the time comes, he will be able to protect her. So the fourth prince asked our heroine to let him be on her side, and he would never betray her. Our heroine didn't understand what was going on, because first there was Cage, and now there was him. What was wrong with being her subordinate if they wanted it so much? At that moment, Leona said that she would become an empress. Looking at Nikhil, she asked what he would do. The guy started shouting and saying that he, of course, also wanted to become an emperor. However, despite this, he would never betray Leona. He swore these words. Even though he still didn't know what the future held for him right now, he wanted to be closer to her and protect her. That's why he asked so hard to be made his subordinate. At that moment, the girl stood up and said that she agreed, but instead, he would rather become her comrade. The guy was so happy that he literally fell on the princess thanking her. Nickel hugged his sister, saying that he would be number 0, while that idiot Ivak would be number 1. The boy smiled and asked his sister to pet him some more. He bragged that everyone would definitely be jealous when they found out that she petted his head, especially Harriet and Ivak. Irina sighed heavily and just thought about how strange all the people here were. At this time, Zeros walked around the library and threw a coin, realizing that he never thought that he would ever fall for such a childish scam. For the first time in his life, he took the oath of a magician like this, which is why he still couldn't believe that it was real. The master of the magic tower was sure that if other wizards found out about this, his reputation would fall to the bottom. He was sure that money was his worst enemy, because once again they had let him down. What is the point of these useless trinkets if there is no way to even use them for their intended purpose? But where does Eskina get gold? Eskina has been hiding for 30 years as the 12th princess, and he immediately assumed that they had crossed paths in a past life. At this point, the silhouette turned to Zeros and said that he was behaving in the palace just like he was at home. The master of the magic tower turned his head and asked if there was any problem with this. Harriet answered him that no matter how friendly the owner of the tower was with the Imperial family, he could not come to the palace and leave whenever he wanted. Zeros assumed that the advisor did not like the fact that he came to the palace, which was very surprising. Anyway, he asked, it wasn't because he had a one-on-one conversation with the 12th princess that he was so worried. The boy screamed in confusion and said that it was all true. He wanted to know why they were meeting with their princess because she was under threat. Zeros asked in surprise, did they really mean that he, a magic teacher, would be dangerous for his own student? The advisor shouted, saying that he had not liked him from the very first moment when he looked as if he was plotting something. At this point, the master of the magic tower assumed that he simply didn't like him. Harriet Ulizer, equally negative, said he was glad Zeros realized this. In any case, the guy asked for what purpose he was trying to get closer to the princess. To say that the magician was surprised is to say nothing, because in the end, it was he who was called to become her mentor. However, he said that his interest in the princess was simply out of curiosity. There was something interesting about her that he wanted to study. A moment later, the emperor's puzzled voice was heard. The emperor walked down the stairs and, looking at Zeros, asked what was so surprising about his daughter. Zeros was shocked that until he announced his presence, he had not noticed him at all. However, the man continued to ask for information. The guy sighed heavily and said that it would be somehow not very pleasant to be responsible for a simple thank you. He began to use acting skills, saying that because of someone's hatred, he received a deep blow to his heart. The emperor, looking at the boy, said that he would give him a magic stone for this. The boy asked the emperor how many stones he would give him. Showing one finger, the man asked if that would really be enough. Zeros sighed in bewilderment and said that this would be extremely little. The emperor had no intention of playing games, so his next move was to offer him 2 boxes. The magician immediately agreed and said that they had agreed, and also that he hoped to deliver them by tomorrow. The guy began to smile, thinking that if he didn't mention the soul, it wouldn't contradict the oath. And yet he began to talk about what concerns the princess, and he came to an interesting conclusion. In his opinion, she is a descendant of a dragon. Harriet Uliser asked in confusion if this meant that the princess had inherited the dragon's powers. Is that what he meant? The guy sighed and said that this was just his guess, which he could see. The advisor was shocked because the last heir of the dragon was the first emperor of Orbis. Even if he reached the rank of the greatest, His Majesty, an ordinary person in the Imperial family, is not the heir of the dragon. Zeros once again decided to emphasize that he is not sure if this is true because it is only his opinion. After all, if this were not so, then the mana in the princess's body would interact differently. What the soul in the princess's body doesn't know is that she is the first 3-year-old child on the continent who possesses 5th-level mana. As soon as Harriet Uliser heard these words, he was perplexed and said that they needed to call the priest and check this. The boy asked His Majesty if he was thinking correctly, but the emperor thought for a moment. The man suddenly said that it was a little strange that he decided to tell such important information so simply. Zeros sighed heavily and said that he was the princess's mentor, so he had to be straightforward. He assumed they were allies of some sort now. Didn't they think so? At this point, the emperor said that this was so, for he could not enter into an alliance with a man who had dealings with Carell. The boy immediately started laughing, surprised that the emperor knew everything. He asked to look at it and say if there was a video on it that he really needed money. The emperor replied that although he was dealing with Carell, he had never done anything that could harm their empire. In any case, even if he had done something to the empire, he would never have left him alive. The boy smiled and said that the emperor was very cruel, but he interrupted him and asked Zeros why he still continued to do this. The emperor reminded him that his brother had already died, and he should know that they would never meet again. At that very moment, Zeros went on the offensive, telling the emperor that he would do well to shut his mouth. The boy asked in surprise if the emperor knew what would happen if he started fighting him at full strength. The man smiled, saying that if he was so sure of it, then they would have to try it. Harriet suddenly apologized for interrupting them in the midst of a duel, but he had something to say. The guy asked if they noticed anything. Soon he decided to tell them straight out that the library was collapsing before their eyes. The guy stopped at that moment, but did not quite understand the essence of what the advisor was saying. Soon he began to speak in bewilderment about how the princess loved this place, and it would be sad if something happened to the library. In any case, the guy assumed that if he wasn't involved in all of this, then he wasn't responsible. And yet he turned to the guys who were ready to fight and asked them to leave it all behind. Before he left, the emperor said that he would keep an eye on him, and if he did anything that could harm the empire, Zeros said with a smile on his face that he already knows what will happen and therefore will try to prevent it. Although he did not guarantee his words, suddenly the emperor turned his head and told the boy that he should have killed him back then. The guy, perplexed, began to shout that he thought the same thing, and moreover, he shouldn't forget that it was he who saved him. As soon as the emperor left, the boy began to shout even louder, saying that they would still see. If he continues to address him, the princess's mentor, like that, then they themselves will regret everything later. The action moves to another estate from which screams were heard. The tray of tea fell to the ground, and the boy shouted in confusion, saying that it was too hot. The eighth prince asked his maids in bewilderment how he could drink such a thing. It was obvious how intimidated the girl was, and she asked for forgiveness with tears in her eyes. Edom in turn began to say that he did not need her apology. It was better for her to go and learn how to do it from the very beginning. And yet he ordered his sword to punish this girl with all severity and then drive her out of the palace. The girl in horror began to scream and ask the gentleman to forgive her because she really was sorry. Then he asked to cut out her tongue as well because she was starting to irritate him. A few moments later, everyone left the room, and the doors to the prince's chambers slammed shut. The guy couldn't contain his anger right away, so he kicked the table to the ground. He was pissed off by everyone around him. The action moves to night. Edom hated the 12th princess and his father with his stupid rules. He certainly wasn't going to let this insult go unpunished, which meant he was going to get his hands on the princess. However, at that moment, a voice came from behind him, telling him that he was a fool. It was the voice of Nikhil, who could not even imagine that for someone, the head is just an ornament. The boy and Ivak laughed at him for deciding to visit the rabbit's palace again. Apparently, he was fearless. It was that evening that these two beat him, and although they knew how precious hands were to a magician, they dared to do such a thing. Time after time, he cursed the 12th princess as well as everyone else who wished him harm. However, at that moment, the sword Edom entered the room carrying a letter from the first prince. The guy screamed in bewilderment, not believing his ears, so he immediately ran up and snatched the paper. Soon he began to read attentively everything his brother wrote, and was pleasantly surprised. The guy assumed that it was time to deal with the impudent people who didn't know their place. At this time, the first prince stood at the window and watched the snow fall. The guy was incredibly happy that it was finally time to return to the palace, where things were supposed to become much more interesting. Soon the action takes us under the cover of moonlight into the deep forest. At this time of day, the action of the story took us to a dark cave, which was far from all people. And it was in it, after decades, that the dragon who had been waiting for his moment finally opened his eyes. The action takes us back to our heroine, who was lying in bed and couldn't understand what she had done to make her so tired. The girl suddenly assumed that this happened because she was spending the rare Eskina. On top of that, he said that he would deceive the head of Matab, and yet the girl knew for sure that she was too tired to talk. At that moment, Rin sat on the edge of the bed, assuming that the princess was very tired. In any case, Cage would soon bring firewood. Our heroine suddenly asked the maid when she would finally grow up because she wanted to be stronger than she was now. The girl smiled and said that if she eats well and sleeps, then she will grow up quickly. Looking at Leona, the maid also said that she was very worried that she would suffer in the battle for the right to inherit. Our heroine assured her that there was no need to worry about her. Rin decided that this was true, since many people in the Imperial family loved her. And anyway, she saw how strong the princess already was, so Rin was very happy. In fact, one could say that our heroine was no less worried than the maid. She is liked by most of the Imperial family, but she has not met everyone yet. She does not know what kind of people the first prince and the sixth princess are. Rin suddenly said that if the princess was worried that something bad might happen, it would be better to trust the people who could protect her. Our heroine stared at the maid in surprise, because she didn't understand who they were talking about. The girl decided to ask directly who she was talking about, because she, for example, was very. But the princess did not have time to finish speaking, because a rumble began in her room. Irina realized in horror that the source of the noise was the killer. But still, why now, when her mana was gone? The girl squeezed her eyes shut, expecting the end. But there was a loud splash, and opening her eyes, she saw a maid in front of her with a blade in her hand. The girl turned her head towards the princess and asked if she was okay. Soon after, Rin lowered her head and noticed that it was all dirty. And again, the girl turned her gaze to the princess, asking what she wanted to say. The princess changed her mind, saying that she wanted to say that Rin was very strong. The maid appreciated this, so she thanked the girl. And yet Irina was shocked. She didn't know what was wrong with these people in the Imperial family. And what's more, did she really have a sword hidden in her skirt? Looking at the killer, who hadn't even managed to do anything, our heroine wondered. How could the nanny have such a high level of skill?